Frans de Waal. Medium. Convincing vestiges of a sexual selective history in which females mated polyandrously can be found in the human male. Perhaps the clearest vestige is testis size. Men's testes are substantially larger, relative to body size, than those of gorillas. Margot Wilson and Martin Daly. Large. Human beings are definitely at the big ball end of the primate spectrum, more like chimpanzees than like gorillas, suggesting that we have long been accustomed to competing via our sperm as well as our bodies. David Barish and Judith Lipton.
As you can see, there is fundamental disagreement over the male package. What are we talking about here? Peanuts or walnuts? Ping pong or bowling? Modern men's testicles are smaller than those of chimps and bonobos, yet they put those of polygynous gorillas and monogamous gibbons to shame, tipping the scales at about half an ounce each. That's about 80 carats if you're a jeweler. Thus, both sides of this pivotal debate can claim evidence for their view simply by declaring that human testicles are relatively large or relatively small. But measuring a testicle is not quite like getting a shoe size. The argument that modern men's testicles would be as big as the chimps if we'd evolved in promiscuous groups is founded on a crucial and erroneous assumption: that human testicles haven't changed in 10,000 years. When Stephen Jay Gould wrote, "There's been no biological change in humans in 40,000 or 50,000 years," he was relying on data that have been supplanted since he died in 2002. This still widely shared assumption grows out of the long-standing belief that evolution operates extremely slowly, requiring thousands of generations to make significant changes. Sometimes it does, but sometimes it doesn't. In The 10,000-Year Explosion, Gregory Cochrane and Henry Harpending show that the human body is capable of very rapid evolutionary change. Humans have changed significantly in body and mind over recorded history, they write, citing resistance to malaria, blue eye color, and lactose tolerance as examples of accelerated evolutionary change since the advent of agriculture. An example they don't discuss in their book, but might consider for future editions, is testicular size. Testicles can change size almost in the blink of an eye, blue or otherwise. In some species of lemurs, small nocturnal primates, testicular volume changes seasonally, swelling up in breeding season and then shrinking back down in the off-season, like a beach ball with a slow leak. Testicular tissue in humans, chimps, and bonobos, but interestingly not gorillas, is controlled by DNA that responds unusually rapidly to environmental changes. Writing in Nature, geneticists Gerald Wyckoff, Hongyi Wang, and Chengyi Wu report, rapid evolution of male reproductive genes is quite notable in the lineages to human and chimpanzee. They go on to note that the rapid response of these genes may well be associated with mating systems. The contrast is intriguing in light of the sociosexual behaviors of African apes. Whereas modern chimpanzees and bonobos are clearly promiscuous, with ample chance of multiple insemination, ovulating female gorillas seem much less likely to be multiply inseminated. Let that soak in for a moment. Humans, chimps, and bonobos, but not gorillas, show accelerated evolution of genes involved in sperm and seminal fluid production associated with multiple insemination. The genes associated with the development of human, chimp, and bonobo testicles are highly responsive to adaptive pressures, far more so than the same genes in gorillas, where females typically mate with only one male. Because they are composed entirely of soft tissue, testicles don't leave a trace in fossils. So, while defenders of the standard narrative assume that human testicular volume has remained constant for millennia, it's now clear this assumption may be wrong. Wyckoff, Wang, and Wu confirm a prediction made by biologist Roger Short back in 1979 when he wrote, "Testis size might be expected to respond rapidly to selection pressures. One of the most intense forms of selection will be found in promiscuous mating systems." Jeffrey Miller agrees. Heritable differences in sperm quality and sperm delivery equipment will be under intense selection. Finally, evolutionary biologist Lynn Margulis and her co-author Dorian Sagan reasoned that men's souped-up genitals, backed by a lot of spermatic firepower, would be worthwhile only if there were some sort of race or contest. Otherwise, they write, they seem excessive. Souped-up genitals? Spermatic firepower? Now we're talking. Indications of spermatic firepower are evident in the differences between a man's first spurts and his last. A human ejaculation typically consists of anywhere from 3 to 9 spurts. Researchers who somehow managed to capture split ejaculates for analysis found that the first spurts contain chemicals that protect against various kinds of chemical attack. What sort of chemical attack? Aside from leukocytes and antigens present in a woman's reproductive tract, more on that later, they protect the sperm from the chemicals in the latter spurts of other men's ejaculate. These final spurts contain a spermicidal substance that slows the advance of any latecomers. In other words, competing sperm from other men seems to be anticipated in the chemistry of men's semen, both in the early spurts, protective, and in the later spurts, attacking. The importance of sperm competition has been debated in scientific conferences and academic journals for the past few decades as if it were a new discovery, but several centuries BCE, Aristotle and his predecessors noted that if a bitch copulated with 2 dogs during a single fertile period, she could produce a litter of pups fathered by one or both of them. And consider the story of Heracles and Iphicles. The night preceding Amphitrion's marriage to Alcmene, Zeus disguised himself as Amphitryon and slept with the bride-to-be. The following night, Amphitryon consummated her marriage. Alcmene had twins, Iphicles, fathered by Amphitryon, and Heracles, fathered by Zeus. Clearly, the ancient Greeks had an inkling of sperm competition. More recently, several researchers have demonstrated that a man's sperm production increases significantly when he has not seen his partner for a few days, regardless of whether or not he ejaculated during her absence. This finding conforms to the notion that sperm competition has played a role in human evolution and may even reflect an adaptation to monogamy. In this scenario, not knowing what his strumpet of a wife was up to at that damned conference in Orlando leads a man's body to hyperproduce sperm to increase his chances of fertilizing her ovum when she gets home, even if his worst fears and possibly hottest fantasies are true. Along these same lines, women have also reported that their partners tend to be more vigorous in bed, reporting deeper, more vigorous thrusting after a separation or if infidelity is suspected. The possibility that the men may actually be turned on by the thought of their mate's possible transgressions appears not to have made its way into the discussion as yet, but note the discussion of porn later. The scandalous implications of sperm competition run smack into the long-held view of sacrosanct female sexuality. It's a vision Darwin cultivated in public consciousness, featuring coy females who surrender only to a carefully chosen mate who has proven himself worthy, and even then she's only doing it for England. The sexually insatiable woman, declared a terrified Donald Simmons, is to be found primarily, if not exclusively, in the ideology of feminism, the hopes of boys, and the fears of men. Perhaps, but Marvin Harris offers a different take, writing, "Like all dominant groups, men seek to promote an image of their subordinate's nature that contributes to the preservation of the status quo. For thousands of years, males have seen women not as women could be, but only as males want them to be." Despite all the controversy, there is no question as to whether sperm competition occurs in human reproduction. It does, every time. A single human ejaculate contains anywhere from 50 million to 500 million applicants, all trying to elbow their way into the only job available, fertilizer-in-chief. The relevant question is whether those applicants are competing against only each other or billions more eager job seekers sent by other men as well. It's hard to conjure a more purely competitive entity than the human spermatozoa. Imagine a teeming school of microscopic salmon whose entire existence consists in straining upstream toward a 1 in several hundred million shot at reproduction. Longish odds, you might say. But not all creatures' sperm face such overwhelmingly slim chances. In some species of insects, for example, fewer than 100 sperm line up for the race to the ovum. Nor are all sperm tiny in comparison to him that sent them. Some species of fruit fly have sperm that measure almost 6 centimeters when uncoiled, several times larger than the fly himself. Homo sapiens is far down at the other extreme, depositing hundreds of millions of tiny sperm at the drop of a hat. Hardcore in the Stone Age. Here's a head-scratcher. Why do so many heterosexual men get off on pornography featuring groups of guys having sex with just one woman? It doesn't add up if you think about it. It's more cone than ice cream. And the suggestive strangeness doesn't end with the counterintuitive male-to-female ratio. It's male ejaculate that puts the money in the money shot. Researchers have confirmed what porn producers already know. Men tend to get turned on by images depicting an environment in which sperm competition is clearly at play, though few, we imagine, think of it in quite these terms. Images and videos showing one woman with multiple males are far more popular on the internet and in commercial pornography than those depicting one male with multiple females. A quick peek at the online offerings at Adult Video Universe lists over 900 titles in the gangbang genre, but only 27 listed under reverse gangbang. You do the math. Why would the males in a species that's been wearing the shackles of monogamy for 1.9 million years be sexually excited by scenes of groups of men ejaculating with 1 or 2 women? Skeptics may argue that this arousal could reflect nothing more than commercial interests or a passing fashion. Fair enough, but what to make of experimental evidence that men viewing erotic material suggestive of sperm competition, 2 men with 1 woman, produce ejaculates containing a higher percentage of motile sperm than men viewing explicit images of only 3 women? And why does being cuckolded consistently appear at or near the top of married men's sexual fantasies, according to experts ranging from Alfred Kinsey to Dan Savage? As far as we know, there is no corresponding taste among women for erotica featuring multiple overweight middle-aged ladies with cheap tattoos, bad haircuts, and black socks having sex with one hot guy. Go figure. Could this male appetite for multi-male scenes be an echo of the porn of the Pleistocene? Keep in mind the variety of societies discussed previously in which women assist and inspire teams of workers or hunters by making themselves available for sequential sex. The same dynamic is hinted at on any given Sunday with fluttering pom-poms, the shortest of shorts, and the highest of kicks, ending with sexy young legs spread right down to the astroturf. While there are other conceivable explanations for such oddities of contemporary life, they certainly align well with a prehistory characterized by sperm competition. Go Trojans! Chapter 17. Sometimes a penis is just a penis.
We are right to note the license and disobedience of this member, which thrusts itself forward too inopportunely when we do not want it to, and which so inopportunely lets us down when we most need it. It imperiously contests for authority with our will. It stubbornly and proudly refuses all our incitements, both of the mind and hand. Michel Montaigne, on the penis, his presumably.
Don't be distracted by the snickering. The human male takes his genitalia very seriously. In ancient Rome, rich boys wore a bulla, a locket holding a replica of a tiny hard-on. This rocket in a locket was known as a fascinum and signified the young man's upper-class status. Today, writes David Friedman in A Mind of Its Own, his amusing and erudite history of the penis, 1,500 years after the fall of imperial Rome, anything as powerful or intriguing as an erection is said to be fascinating. Going back a bit farther, we find that in the biblical books of Genesis and Exodus, Jacob's children sprang from his thigh. Most historians agree that thigh is actually a polite way of referring to that which hangs between a man's thighs. It seems clear, writes Friedman, that sacred oaths between Israelites were sealed by placing a hand on the male member. So, according to Friedman at least, the act of swearing on one's balls lives on in the world today. Historical oddities aside, some argue that moderately sized human testicles and lower human sperm concentration relative to chimpanzees and bonobos disprove any significant sperm competition in human evolution. True, the reported range of human sperm concentration of 60-235 times 10 to the 6 per milliliter pales in comparison to that of chimps, an impressive 548 times 10 to the 6th. But not all sperm competition is created equal. For example, some species have seminal fluid that forms a copulatory plug, serving to block the entrance of any subsequent sperm into the cervical canal. Species engaging in this type of sperm competition, snakes, rodents, some insects, kangaroos, typically wield penises with elaborate hooks or curlicues on the end that function to pull any previous male's plug out of the cervical opening. Though at least one team of researchers reports data suggesting men who copulate frequently produce semen that coagulates for a longer time, copulatory plugs don't appear to be in the human sexual arsenal. Despite its lack of curlicues, the human penis is not without interesting design features. Primate sexuality expert Alan Dixon writes, "In primates which live in family groups consisting of an adult pair plus offspring, such as gibbons, the male usually has a small and relatively unspecialized penis. Say what you will about the human penis, but it ain't small or unspecialized." Reproductive biologist Roger Short, real name, writes, "The great size of the erect human penis, in marked contrast to that of the great apes, makes one wonder what particular evolutionary forces have been at work." Jeffrey Miller just comes out and says it. "Adult male humans have the longest, thickest, and most flexible penises of any living primate." So there. Homo sapiens, the great ape with the great penis. The unusual flared glands of the human penis forming the coronal ridge, combined with the repeated thrusting action characteristic of human intercourse, ranging anywhere from 10 to 500 thrusts per romantic interlude, creates a vacuum in the female's reproductive tract. This vacuum pulls any previously deposited semen away from the ovum, thus aiding the sperm about to be sent into action. But wouldn't this vacuum action also draw away a man's own sperm? No, because upon ejaculation, the head of the penis shrinks in size before any loss of tumescence, stiffness, in the shaft, thus neutralizing the suction that might have pulled his own boys back. Very clever. Intrepid researchers have demonstrated this process, known as semen displacement, using artificial semen made of cornstarch, the same recipe used to simulate exaggerated ejaculates in many pornographic films, latex vaginas and artificial penises in a proper university laboratory setting. Professor Gordon G. Gallup and his team reported that more than 90% of the cornstarch mixture was displaced with just a single thrust of their lab penis. We theorize that as a consequence of competition for paternity, human males evolved uniquely configured penises that function to displace semen from the vagina left by other males, Gallup told BBC News Online. It bears repeating that the human penis is the longest and thickest of any primates in both absolute and relative terms. And despite all the bad press they get, men last far longer in the saddle than bonobos, 15 seconds, chimps, 7 seconds, or gorillas, 60 seconds, clocking in between 4 and 7 minutes on average. The chimpanzee penis, meanwhile, is a thin, conical appendage without the flared glands of the human member. Nor is sustained thrusting common to chimpanzee or bonobo copulation. But really, how much sustained anything can you expect in 7 seconds? So, while our closest ape cousins may have us beat in the testicles department, they lose to the human penis on size, duration, and cool design features. Furthermore, the average seminal volume in a human ejaculate is about 4 times that of chimpanzees, bringing the total number of sperm cells per ejaculate within range of the chimps. Returning to the question of whether the human scrotum is half empty or half full, the very existence of the external human scrotum suggests sperm competition in human evolution. Gorillas and gibbons, like most other mammals that don't engage in sperm competition, generally aren't equipped for it. A scrotum is like a spare refrigerator in the garage just for beer. If you've got a spare beer fridge, you're probably the type who expects a party to break out at any moment. You want to be prepared. A scrotum fulfills the same function. By keeping the testicles a few degrees cooler than they would be inside the body, a scrotum allows chilled spermatozoa to accumulate and remain viable longer, available if needed. Anyone who's been kicked in the beer fridge can tell you this is a potentially costly arrangement. The increased vulnerability of having testes out there in the wind, inviting attack or accident rather than tucked away safely inside the body, is hard to overstate, especially if you're crumpled in the fetal position, unable to breathe. Given the unrelenting logic of evolutionary cost-benefit analyses, we can be quite certain this is not an adaptation without good reason. Why carry the tools if you don't have the job? There is compelling evidence pointing to a dramatic reduction in human sperm production and testicular volume in recent times. Researchers have documented worrisome decreases in average sperm count, as well as reduced vitality of the sperm that do survive. One researcher suggests that average sperm counts in Danish men have plummeted from 113 times 10 to the 6th in 1940 to about half that in 1990, 66 times 10 to the 6th. The list of potential causes for the collapse is long, ranging from estrogen-like compounds in soybeans and the milk of pregnant cows to pesticides, fertilizers, growth hormones in cattle, and chemicals used in plastics. Recent research suggests the widely prescribed antidepressant paroxetine, sold as Seroxat or Paxil, may damage DNA in sperm cells. The Human Reproduction Study at the University of Rochester found that men whose mothers had eaten beef more than 7 times per week while pregnant were 3 times more likely to be classified as subfertile, fewer than 20 million sperm per milliliter of seminal fluid. Among these sons of beef eaters, the rate of subfertility was 17.7%, as opposed to 5.7% among men whose mothers ate beef less often. Humans seem to have much more sperm-producing tissue than any monogamous or polygynous primate would need. Men produce only about 1/3 to 1/8 as much sperm per gram of spermatogenic tissue as 8 other mammals tested. Researchers have noted similar surplus capacities in other aspects of human sperm and semen production physiology. The correlation between infrequent ejaculation and various health problems offers further evidence that present-day men are not using their reproductive equipment to its fullest potential. A team of Australian researchers, for example, found that men who had ejaculated more than 5 times per week between the ages of 20 and 50 were 1/3 less likely to develop prostate cancer later in life. Along with the fructose, potassium, zinc, and other benign components of semen, trace amounts of carcinogens are often present, So researchers hypothesize that the reduction in cancer rates may be due to the frequent flushing of the ducts. A different team from Sydney University reported in late 2007 that daily ejaculation dramatically reduced DNA damage to men's sperm cells, thereby increasing male fertility, quite the opposite of the conventional wisdom. After 42 men with damaged sperm were instructed to ejaculate daily for a week, almost all showed less chromosomal damage than a control group who had abstained for 3 days. Frequent orgasm is associated with better cardiac health as well. A study conducted at the University of Bristol and Queen's University of Belfast found that men who have 3 or more orgasms per week are 50% less likely to die from coronary heart disease. Use it or lose it is one of the basic tenets of natural selection. With its relentless economizing, evolution rarely equips an organism for a task not performed. If contemporary levels of sperm and semen production were typical of our ancestors, it is unlikely our species would have evolved so much surplus capacity. Contemporary men have far more potential than they use. But if it's true that modern human testicles are mere shadows of their former selves, what happened? Since the infertile leave no descendants, it's a truism in evolutionary theory that infertility can't be inherited. But low fertility can be passed along under certain conditions. As discussed above, chromosomes in humans, chimps, and bonobos associated with sperm-producing tissue respond very rapidly to adaptive pressures, far more rapidly than other parts of the genome or the corresponding chromosomes in gorillas, for example. In the reproductive environment we envision, characterized by frequent sexual interaction, females would typically have mated with multiple males during each ovulatory period, as do female chimps and bonobos. Thus, men with impaired fertility would have been unlikely to father children, as their sperm cells would have been overwhelmed by those of other sexual partners. The genes for robust sperm production are strongly favored in such an environment, while mutations resulting in decreased male fertility would have been filtered out of the gene pool, as they still are in chimps and bonobos. But now consider the repercussions of culturally imposed sexual monogamy, even if enforced only for women, as was often the case until recently. In a monogamous mating system, where a woman has sex with only one man, there is no sperm competition with other males. Sex becomes like an election in a dictatorship. Just one candidate can win, no matter how few votes are cast. So even a man with impaired sperm production is likely to ring the bell eventually, thus conceiving sons and perhaps daughters with increased potential for weakened fertility. In this scenario, genes associated with reduced fertility would no longer be removed from the gene pool. They'd spread, resulting in a steady reduction in overall male fertility and generalized atrophy of human sperm production tissue. Just as eyeglasses have allowed survival and reproduction for people with visual incapacities that would have doomed them and their genes in ancestral environments, sexual monogamy permits fertility-reducing mutations to proliferate, causing testicular diminishments that would never have lasted among our non-monogamous ancestors. The most recent estimates show that sperm dysfunction affects about 1 in 20 men around the world, being the single most common cause of subfertility in couples, defined as no pregnancy after a year of trying. Every indication is that the problem is growing steadily worse. Nobody's maintaining the spare fridge much anymore, so it's breaking down. If our paradigm of prehistoric human sexuality is correct, in addition to environmental toxins and food additives, sexual monogamy may be a significant factor in the contemporary infertility crisis. Widespread monogamy may also help explain why, despite our promiscuous past, the testicles of contemporary Homo sapiens are smaller than those of chimps and bonobos, and, as indicated by our excess sperm production capacity, than those of our own ancestors. Sexual monogamy itself may be shrinking men's balls. Perhaps we can declare an end to the standoff between those who argue that small human testicles tell a story of romance and bonding between the sexes going back a long time, perhaps to the beginning of our lineage, and those who contend that our slightly larger than they should be if we're really monogamous testicles indicate many millennia of mild polygyny. Humans have medium-sized testicles by primate standards, with strong indications of recent dwindling, but can still produce ejaculates teeming with hundreds of millions of spermatozoa. Along with a penis adapted to sperm competition, human testicles strongly suggest ancestral females had multiple lovers within a menstrual cycle. Human testicles are the equivalent of drying apples on a November tree, shrinking reminders of days gone by. As a way of testing this hypothesis, we should find that relative penis and testicle data differ among racial and cultural groups. These differences, theoretically due to significant and consistent differences in the intensity of sperm competition in recent historical times, are what we do find if we dare to look. Because fit is so important in the effectiveness of condoms, World Health Organization guidelines specify different sizes for various parts of the world. A 49mm width condom for Asia, a 52mm width for North America and Europe, and a 53mm width for Africa. All condoms are longer than most men will ever need. The condoms manufactured in China for their domestic market are 49mm wide. According to a study conducted by the Indian Council of Medical Research, high levels of slippage and failure are due to a bad fit between many Indian men and the international standards used in condom manufacture. According to an article published in Nature, Japanese and Chinese men's testicles tend to be smaller than those of Caucasian men on average. The authors of the study concluded that differences in body size make only a slight contribution to these values. Other researchers have confirmed these general trends, finding average combined testes weights of 24 grams for Asians, 29 to 33 grams for Caucasians, and 50 grams for Africans. Researchers found marked differences in testis size among human races. Even controlling for age differences among samples, adult male Danes have testes that are more than twice the size of their Chinese equivalents, for example. This ranges far beyond what average racial differences in body size would predict. Various estimates conclude that Caucasians produce about twice the number of spermatozoa per day than do Chinese, 185 minus 235 times 10 to the 6th, compared with 84 times 10 to the 6th. These are dangerous waters we're swimming in, dear reader, suggesting that culture, environment, and behavior can be reflected in anatomy, genital anatomy at that. But any serious biologist or physician knows there are anatomical differences expressed racially. Despite the hair-trigger sensitivity of these issues, not to consider racial background in the diagnosis and treatment of disease would be unethical. Still, some of the reluctance to connect culturally sanctioned behavior with genital anatomy is as much due to the difficulty of finding reliable historical information about true rates of female promiscuity as to the emotionally charged nature of the material itself. Furthermore, diet and environmental factors would have to be factored in before arriving at any solid conclusions regarding the relationship between sexual monogamy and genital anatomy. For example, many Asian diets include large quantities of soy products, while many Western people consume large quantities of beef, both having been shown to cause rapid generational reduction in testicular volume and spermatogenesis. Given the controversial nature of such research and the complexities of eliminating so many variables, perhaps it's not surprising that this is an area few researchers are eager to enter. There is a wide world of evidence that human sexual activity goes far beyond what's needed for reproduction. While the social function of sex is now seen mainly in terms of maintaining the nuclear family, this is far from the only way societies channel human sexual energies to promote social stability. Coming in at hundreds or thousands of copulations per child born, human beings outcopulate even chimpanzees and bonobos and are far beyond gorillas and gibbons. When the average duration of each copulation is factored in, the sheer amount of time spent in sexual activity by human beings easily surpasses that of any other primate, even if we agree to ignore all our fantasizing, dreaming, and masturbating. The evidence that sperm competition played a role in human evolution is simply overwhelming. In the words of one researcher, without sperm warfare during human evolution, men would have tiny genitals and produce few sperm. There would be no thrusting during intercourse, no sex dreams or fantasies, no masturbation, and we would each feel like having intercourse only a dozen or so times in our entire lives. Sex and society, art and literature, in fact the whole of human culture, would be different. We can add to this list the fact that men and women would be the same height and weight if monogamous, or that men would likely be twice the size of women if polygynous. Just as Darwin's famous finches in the Galapagos evolved different beak structures for cracking different seeds, related species often evolve different mechanisms for sperm competition. The sexual evolution of chimps and bonobos followed a strategy dependent upon repeated ejaculations of small but highly concentrated deposits of sperm cells, while humans evolved an approach featuring a penis designed to pull back pre-existing sperm with extended repeated thrusting, less frequent compared to chimps and bonobos, but larger ejaculates, testicular volume and libido far beyond what's needed for monogamous or polygynous mating, rapid reaction DNA controlling development of testicular tissue, this DNA apparently being absent in monogamous or polygynous primates, overall sperm content per ejaculate, even today, in the range of chimps and bonobos, and the precarious location of the testicles in a vulnerable external scrotum associated with promiscuous mating. In Spanish, the word esperar can mean to expect or to hope, depending on context. Archaeology, writes Bugacki, is very much constrained by what the modern imagination allows in the range of human behavior. So is evolutionary theory. Perhaps so many still conclude that sexual monogamy is characteristic of our species' evolutionary past, despite the clear messages inscribed in every man's body and appetites, because this is what they expect and hope to find there. Chapter 18. The Prehistory of O.
Now there you have a sample of man's reasoning powers, as he calls them. He observes certain facts, for instance, that in all his life he never sees the day that he can satisfy one woman. Also that no woman ever sees the day that she can't overwork and defeat and put out of commission any 10 masculine plants that can be put to bed to her. He puts those strikingly suggestive and luminous facts together, and from them draws this astonishing conclusion. The Creator intended the woman to be restricted to one man. Mark Twain, Letters from the Earth.
We recently spotted a young man strolling down Las Ramblas in Barcelona, proudly sporting a T-shirt proclaiming that he was born to fuck. One wonders whether he has a whole set of these shirts at home. Born to breathe, born to eat, born to drink, born to shit, and of course the depressing but inevitable born to die. But maybe he was making a deeper point. After all, the argument central to this book is that sex has long served many crucial functions for Homo sapiens, with reproduction being only the most obvious among them. Since we human beings spend more time and energy planning, executing, and recalling our sexual exploits than any other species on Earth, maybe we should all wear such shirts. Or maybe just the women. When it comes to sex, men may be trash-talking sprinters, but it's the women who win all the marathons. Any marriage counselor will tell you the most common sex-related complaint women make about men is that they are too quick and too direct. Meanwhile, men's most frequent sex-related gripe about women is that they take too damned long to get warmed up. After an orgasm, a woman may be anticipating a dozen more. A female body in motion tends to stay in motion, but men come and go. For them, the curtain falls quickly and the mind turns to unrelated matters. This symmetry of dual disappointment illustrates the almost comical incompatibility between men's and women's sexual response in the context of monogamous mating. You have to wonder, if men and women evolved together in sexually monogamous couples for millions of years, how did we end up being so incompatible? It's as if we've been sitting down to dinner together millennium after millennium, but half of us can't help wolfing everything down in a few frantic, sloppy minutes, while the other half are still setting the table and lighting candles. Yes, we know, mixed strategies, lots of cheap sperm versus a few expensive eggs in one basket, and so on. But these flagrantly maladjusted sexual responses make far more sense when viewed as relics of our having evolved in promiscuous groups. Rather than spinning theories within theories in an effort to prop up an unstable paradigm, monogamy with mistakes, mild polygyny, mixed mating strategies, serial monogamy, can we simply face the one scenario where none of this self-contradicting, inconsistent, special pleading is necessary? Okay, fine, it's embarrassing, maybe even humiliating if you're prone to that sort of thing, but 150 years after On the Origin of Species was published, isn't it time to accept that our ancestors evolved along a sexual trajectory similar to that of our two highly social, very intelligent, closely related primate cousins? With any other question we have about the origins of human behavior, we look to chimps and bonobos for important clues: language, tool use, political alliances, war, reconciliation, altruism. But when it comes to sex, we prudishly turn away from these models to the distantly related, antisocial, low IQ, but monogamous gibbon. Really? We've pointed out how the agricultural revolution triggered radical social reconfigurations from which we're still reeling. Perhaps the far-fetched denial of our promiscuous sexual prehistory expresses a legitimate fear of social instability, but insistent demands for a stable social order, based, as we're often reminded, upon the nuclear family unit, cannot erase the effects of the hundreds of thousands of years that came before our species settled into stable villages. If female chimps and bonobos could talk, do we really think they'd be griping to their hairy girlfriends about prematurely ejaculating males who don't bring flowers anymore? Probably not, because as we've seen, when a female chimp or bonobo is in the mood, she's likely to be the center of plenty of eager male attraction, and the more attention she gets, the more she attracts, because, as it turns out, our male primate cousins get turned on by the sight and sound of others of their species having sex. Imagine that.
What horrid extravagancies of mind! No man, who is but never so little versed in such matters, is ignorant. What grievous symptoms the rising, bearing down, and perversion, and convulsion of the womb do excite! What horrid extravagancies of mind! What frenzies, melancholy distempers, and outrageousness the preternatural diseases of the womb do induce, as if affected persons were enchanted. William Harvey. Anatomical Exercitations Concerning the Generation of Living Creatures. 1653.
Hysteria was one of the first diseases to be described formally. Hippocrates discussed it in the 4th century BCE, and you'll find it in any medical text covering women's health written from medieval times, until it was removed from the list of recognized medical diagnoses in 1952, 21 years before homosexuality was finally removed. Hysteria was still one of the most diagnosed diseases in the United States and Great Britain as recently as the early 20th century. You might wonder how physicians treated this chronic condition over the centuries. We'll tell you. doctors masturbated their female patients to orgasm. According to historian Rachel Maines, female patients were routinely massaged to orgasm from the time of Hippocrates until the 1920s. Have a seat. The doctor will be right with you. While some passed the job off to nurses, most physicians performed the therapy themselves, though apparently not without some difficulty. Nathaniel Highmore, writing in 1660, noted that it was not an easy technique to learn, being not unlike that game of boys in which they try to rub their stomachs with one hand and pat their heads with the other. Whatever challenges male physicians faced in mastering the technique, it seems to have been worth the effort. The Health and Diseases of Women, published in 1873, estimates that about 75% of American women were in need of these treatments, and that they constituted the single largest market for therapeutic services. Despite Donald Simmons's protestations that, among all peoples, sexual intercourse is understood to be a service or favor that females render to males, it seems that for centuries, orgasmic release was a service male doctors rendered to women, for a price. Much of this information comes from The Technology of Orgasm, Maines's wonderful book on this disease and its treatment through the centuries. And what were the symptoms of this disease? Unsurprisingly, they were identical to those of sexual frustration and chronic arousal: anxiety, sleeplessness, irritability, nervousness, erotic fantasy, sensations of heaviness in the abdomen, lower pelvic edema, and vaginal lubrication. This supposed medical treatment for horny, frustrated women was not an isolated aberration confined to ancient history, but just one element in an ancient crusade to pathologize the demands of the female libido, a libido that experts have long insisted hardly exists. The men who provided this lucrative therapy didn't write about orgasm in the medical articles they published on hysteria and its treatment. Rather, they published serious, sober discussion of vulvular massage leading to nervous paroxysm that brought temporary relief to the patient. These were ideal patients, after all. They didn't die or recover from their condition. They just kept returning, eager for more treatment sessions. This arrangement might strike some readers as the very definition of good work if you can get it, but many physicians apparently felt otherwise. Maines found no evidence that male physicians enjoyed providing pelvic massage treatments. On the contrary, this male elite sought every opportunity to substitute other devices for their fingers. What other devices does Maines have in mind? See if you can finish this series. 1. Sewing machine. 2. Fan. 3. Tea kettle. 4. Toaster. 5. Question mark. Here's a hint. These are the first 5 electrical appliances sold directly to American consumers. Give up? The Hamilton Beach Company of Racine, Wisconsin, patented the first home-use vibrator in 1902, thereby making it just the 5th electrical appliance approved for domestic use. By 1917, there were more vibrators than toasters in American homes. But before it became an instrument for self-treatment, all the pleasures of youth will throb within you, one suggestive ad promised. Vibrators had already been in use for decades in the offices of physicians who'd grown weary of rubbing their stomachs and patting their heads at the same time. Motivated by the wonders of industrialization, many doctors had sought a way to mechanize the delivery of their treatment. American ingenuity would mass-produce orgasms for women who were denied them in their properly chaste, sexually deprived lives. The first vibrators were invented by these enterprising physicians. Late 19th and early 20th century medical tinkerers designed all sorts of devices to provoke the necessary nervous paroxysms in their patients. Some were diesel-powered, others ran on steam, like little locomotives that could. Some were huge contraptions hanging from the rafters on chains and pulleys, like engine blocks at an auto shop. Others sported pistons thrusting dildos through holes in tables, or involved high-pressure water directed at the patient's genitalia, like a fire brigade called in to douse the consuming flames of female passion. And all the while, the good doctors never publicly admitted that what they were doing was more sex than medicine. But perhaps even more dumbfounding than their silence on being paid to provoke nervous paroxysms, like so many Chippendale studs, is the fact that these same medical authorities managed to maintain the conviction that female sexuality was a weak and reluctant thing. The medical monopoly on providing socially acceptable extramarital orgasms to women was assured by a strict prohibition against women or girls masturbating themselves to orgasm. In 1850, the New Orleans Medical and Surgical Journal declared masturbation public enemy number 1, warning, "Neither plague, nor war, nor smallpox, nor a crowd of similar evils have resulted more disastrously for humanity than the habit of masturbation. It is the destroying element of civilized society." Children and adults were warned that masturbation was not only sinful, but very dangerous, sure to result in severe health consequences, including blindness, infertility, and insanity. Besides, these authorities intoned, normal women had little sexual desire anyway. In his Psychopathia Sexualis, published in 1886, German neurologist Richard von Krafft-Ebing declared what everyone already thought they knew. If a woman is normally developed mentally and well-bred, her sexual desire is small. If this were not so, the whole world would become a brothel and marriage and a family impossible. To have suggested that women enjoyed, indeed needed, regular orgasmic release would have been shocking to men and humiliating to most women. Perhaps it still is. While the anti-masturbation frenzy has roots deep in Judeo-Christian history, it found unfortunate medical support in Simon André Tissot's A Treatise on the Disease Produced by Onanism, published in 1758. Tissot apparently recognized the symptoms of syphilis and gonorrhea, which were considered a single disease at the time. But he misunderstood these symptoms as signs of semen depletion due to promiscuity, prostitution, and masturbation. A century later, in 1858, a British gynecologist named Isaac Baker Brown, president of the Medical Society of London at the time, proposed that most women's diseases were attributable to overexcitement of the nervous system, with the pudic nerve, which runs to the clitoris, being particularly culpable. He listed the 8 stages of progressive disease triggered by female masturbation. 1. Hysteria. 2. Spinal irritation. 3. Hysterical epilepsy. 4. Cataleptic fits. 5. Epileptic fits. 6. Idiocy. 7. Mania. 8. Death. Baker Brown argued that surgical removal of the clitoris was the best way to prevent this fatal slide from pleasure to idiocy to death. After gaining considerable celebrity and performing an unknown number of clitorectomies, Baker Brown's methods fell out of favor, and he was expelled from the London Obstetrical Society in disgrace. Baker Brown subsequently went insane, and clitorectomy was discredited in British medical circles. Unfortunately, Baker Brown's writing had already had a significant impact on medical practice across the Atlantic. Clitorectomies continued to be performed in the United States well into the 20th century as a cure for hysteria, nymphomania, and female masturbation. As late as 1936, Holt's Diseases of Infancy and Childhood, a respected medical school text, recommended surgical removal or cauterization of the clitoris as a cure for masturbation in girls. By the middle of the 20th century, as the procedure was finally falling into disrepute in the United States, it was revived with a new rationale. Now, rather than a way to stamp out masturbation, surgical removal of large clitorises was recommended for cosmetic purposes. Before becoming a target for surgery, the clitoris had been ignored by male authors of elaborate anatomical sketchbooks for centuries. It wasn't until the mid-1500s that a Venetian professor by the name of Matteo Realdo Colombo, who had previously studied anatomy with Michelangelo, stumbled upon a mysterious protuberance between a woman's legs. As described in Federico Andahasi's historical novel The Anatomist, Colombo made this discovery while examining a patient named Inés de Torremolinos. Colombo noted that Inés grew tense when he manipulated this small button, and that it appeared to grow in size at his touch. Clearly, this would require further exploration. After examining scores of other women, Colombo found that all of them had this same heretofore undiscovered protuberance, and that they all responded similarly to gentle manipulation. In March of 1558, Andahasi tells us that Colombo proudly reported his discovery of the clitoris to the dean of his faculty. As Jonathan Margolis speculates in O, The Intimate History of the Orgasm, the response was probably not what Colombo had anticipated. The professor was arrested in his classroom within days, accused of heresy, blasphemy, witchcraft, and Satanism, put on trial, and imprisoned. His manuscripts were confiscated, and his discovery was never permitted to be mentioned again until centuries after his death. Beware the devil's teat. The illness that led frustrated women to the offices of vibrator-wielding doctors a century ago often led someplace far worse in medieval Europe. As historian Ray Tannehill explains, the Malleus Maleficarum, 1486, the first great handbook of the witch inquisitors, had no more difficulty than a modern psychoanalyst in accepting that a certain type of woman might readily believe she had had intercourse with the devil himself, a huge, black, monstrous being with an enormous penis and seminal fluid as cold as ice water. But it wasn't only sexual dreams that attracted the brutal attentions of erotophobic authorities. If a witch hunter in the 1600s discovered a woman or girl with an unusually large clitoris, this devil's teat was sufficient to condemn her to death. Medieval Europe suffered periodic plagues of incubi and succubi, male and female demons thought to be invading the dreams, beds, and bodies of living people. Thomas Aquinas and others believed that these demons impregnated women on their nocturnal visits by first posing as a succubus, a female spirit who has sex with a sleeping man in order to obtain his sperm, and then depositing the sperm in an unsuspecting woman in the form of an incubus, a male spirit ravishing a sleeping woman. Women thus thought to have been impregnated by malevolent spirits flitting about like nocturnal honeybees, were at special risk of being exposed as witches and dealt with accordingly. Any stories these women might have told regarding the true origins of their pregnancy conveniently died with them. Though now considered one of the finest novels ever written, Madame Bovary was denounced as immoral when it was first published in late 1856. Public prosecutors in Paris were upset that Gustave Flaubert portrayed a headstrong peasant girl who flaunted the rules of established propriety by taking lovers. They felt her character met with insufficient punishment. Flaubert's defense was that the work was eminently moral on those terms. After all, Emma Bovary dies by her own hand in misery, poverty, shame, and desperation. Insufficient punishment? The case against the book, in other words, turned on whether Emma Bovary's punishment was agonizing and horrible enough, not on whether she deserved such suffering at all or had any right to pursue sexual fulfillment in the first place. But even Flaubert and his misogynistic prosecutors could never have dreamed up the punishments said to befall immodest women among the Tzotzil Maya of Central America. Sarah Blaffer Hrdy explains that the Hikal, a supersex demon with a several-foot-long penis, seizes women who have misbehaved, carrying them off to his cave where he rapes them. Little girls are told that any woman unlucky enough to become pregnant by the Hikal swells up and then gives birth night after night until she dies. This apparent need to punish female sexual desire as something evil, dangerous, and pathological is not limited to medieval times or remote Mayan villages. Recent estimates by the World Health Organization suggest that approximately 137 million girls undergo some form of genital mutilation every year.
The force required to suppress it. A fire is never sated by any amount of logs, nor the ocean by rivers that flow into it. Death cannot be sated by all the creatures in the world, nor a fair-eyed woman by any amount of men. The Kama Sutra.
Before the war on drugs, the war on terror, or the war on cancer, there was the war on female sexual desire. It's a war that has been raging far longer than any other, and its victims number well into the billions by now. Like the others, it's a war that can never be won, as the declared enemy is a force of nature. We may as well declare war on the cycles of the moon. There is a pathetic futility animating the centuries-long insistence, against overwhelming evidence to the contrary, that the human female is indifferent to the insistent urgings of libido. Recall the medical authorities in the antebellum South who assured plantation owners that slaves trying to break out of their chains were not human beings deserving of freedom and dignity, but sufferers of drapetomania, a medical disorder best cured with a good lashing. And who can forget the well-intentioned Inquisition that forced Galileo to disown truths as obvious to him as they were offensive to minds calcified by power and doctrine? In this ongoing struggle between what is and what many post-agricultural patriarchal societies insist must be, women who have dared to renounce the credo of the coy female are still spat upon, insulted, divorced, separated from their children, banished, burned as witches, pathologized as hysterics, buried to their necks in desert sand, and stoned to death. They and their children, those sons and daughters of bitches, are still sacrificed to the perverse, conflicted gods of ignorance, shame, and fear. If psychiatrist Mary Jane Sherfy was correct when she wrote, "The strength of the drive determines the force required to suppress it," an observation downright Newtonian in its irrefutable simplicity, then what are we to make of the force brought to bear on the suppression of female libido? Chapter 19. When Girls Go Wild. Female copulatory vocalization. Here's a question we ask the audience every time we give a public presentation. If you've ever heard a heterosexual couple having sex, and who hasn't, which partner was louder? The answer we get every time, every place, from men, women, straight, gay, American, French, Japanese, and Brazilians, is always the same. Hands down, no question about it. Not even close. We don't have to tell you because you already know, don't you? Yes, the meek, demure, coy sex is the source of the high-decibel moaning, groaning, and calling out to the good Lord above, neighbors be damned. But why? Within the framework of the standard narrative of human sexuality, what scientists call female copulatory vocalization, FCV, is a major conundrum. You'll recall Steven Pinker's claim that, in all societies, sex is at least somewhat dirty. It is conducted in private. Why would the female of such a species risk attracting all that attention? Why is it that from the Lower East Side to the upper reaches of the Amazon, women are far more likely than men to loudly announce their sexual pleasure for all to hear? And why is the sound of a woman having an orgasm so difficult for heterosexual men to ignore? They say women can hear a baby crying from a great distance, but gentlemen, we ask you, is there any sound easier to pick out of the cacophony of an apartment block and harder to ignore than that of a woman lost in passion? If you're one of the 10 or 15 people alive who have never seen Meg Ryan's fake orgasm scene in When Harry Met Sally, go watch it now. It's easily accessible online. It's one of the best-known scenes in all of modern cinema, but if the roles were reversed, the scene wouldn't be funny. It wouldn't even make sense. Imagine, Billy Crystal sits at the restaurant table. He starts breathing harder. Maybe his eyes bug out a bit. He grunts a few times, takes a few bites of his sandwich, and falls asleep. No big laughs. Nobody in the deli even notices. If male orgasm is a muffled crash of cymbals, female orgasm is a full-on opera. full of screaming, shouting, singing people standing around with spears, and table pounding sure to quiet even the noisiest New York deli. Female cries of ecstasy aren't a modern phenomenon. The Kama Sutra contains ancient advice on female copulatory vocalization in terms of erotic technique, categorizing an aviary of ecstatic expression a woman might choose from. As a major part of moaning, she may use, according to her imagination, the cries of the dove, cuckoo, green pigeon, parrot, bee, nightingale, goose, duck, and partridge. A goose? Honk if you heart sex. But apart from barnyard erotic technique, it just doesn't make sense for the female of a monogamous or mildly polygynous species to call attention to herself when mating. On the other hand, if thousands of generations of multiple mating are built into modern human sexuality, it's pretty clear what all the shouting's about. As it turns out, women aren't the only female primates making a lot of noise in the throes of passion. British primatologist Stuart Semple found that, in a wide variety of species, females vocalize just before, during, and immediately after they mate. These vocalizations, Semple says, are particularly common among the primates, and evidence is now accumulating that by calling, a female incites males in her group. Precisely. There's a good reason the sound of a woman enjoying a sexual encounter entices a heterosexual man. Her copulation call is a potential invitation to come hither, thus provoking sperm competition. Semple recorded more than 550 copulation calls from 7 different female baboons and analyzed their acoustic structure. He found that these complex vocalizations contained information related both to the female's reproductive state — the vocalizations were more complex when females were closer to ovulation — and to the status of the male inspiring any given vocalization. Calls were longer and contained more distinct sonic units during matings with higher-ranked males. Thus, in these baboons at least, listening males could presumably gain information as to their likelihood of impregnating a calling female, as well as some sense of the rank of the male they'd find with her if they approached. Meredith Small agrees that the copulation calls of female primates are easily identifiable. Even the uninitiated can identify female non-human primate orgasm or sexual pleasure. Females, Small tells us, make noises not heard in any other context but mating. Female lion-tailed macaques use copulation calls to invite male attention even when not ovulating. Small reports that among these primates, ovulating females most often directed their invitations at males outside their own troop, thus bringing new blood into the mating mix. Female copulatory vocalization is highly associated with promiscuous mating, but not with monogamy. Alan Dixon has noted that the females of promiscuous primate species emit more complex mating calls than females of monogamous or polygynous species. Complexity aside, Gauri Pradhan and his colleagues conducted a survey of copulation calls in a variety of primates and found that variation in females' promiscuity predicts their tendency to use copulation calls in conjunction with mating. Their data shows that higher levels of promiscuity predict more frequent copulation calls. William J. Hamilton and Patricia C. Arrowwood analyzed the copulatory vocalizations of various primates, including 3 human couples going at it. They noticed that female sounds gradually intensified as orgasm approached, and at orgasm assumed a rapid, regular, equal note lengths and inter-note intervals, rhythm absent in the male's calls at orgasm. Still, the authors can't help sounding a tad let down when they note, neither sex of human showed the complexity of note structure characteristic of baboon copulatory vocalizations. But that's probably a good thing, because elsewhere in their article, we learn that female baboons' copulation calls are clearly audible to even human ears from 300 meters away. Before you conclude that female copulatory vocalization is just a fancy phrase for a little excitement, think about the predators possibly alerted by this primate passion. Chimps and bonobos may be out of reach up in the branches, But baboons, like our grand-dwelling ancestors, live among leopards and other predators who would be quite interested in a 2-for-1 special on fresh primate, especially given a mating pair's distracted, vulnerable state. As Hamilton and Arrowood put it, in spite of the risk of exposure of individuals and the troop to predators, these baboons habitually call during copulation, so the calls must have some adaptive value. What could that be? The authors offered several hypotheses, including the notion that the calls may be a stratagem to help activate the male's ejaculatory reflex, an analysis with which many prostitutes would presumably agree. Perhaps there is something to this idea, but even so, male primates are not known for needing a great deal of assistance in activating their ejaculatory reflex. If anything, the human male ejaculatory reflex tends to be too easily activated, at least from the perspective of women not being paid to activate it as quickly as possible. Especially given all the other convergent evidence, it seems far more likely that in humans, female copulatory vocalization would serve to attract males to the ovulating, sexually receptive female, thus promoting sperm competition with all its attendant benefits, both reproductive and social. Yet, despite all the loud carrying on by women the world over, the credo of the coy female persists, writes Natalie Angier. It is garlanded with qualifications and is admitted to be an imperfect portrayal of female mating strategies, but then, that little matter of etiquette attended to, the credo is stated once again. Sin tetas no hay paraíso. For better or worse, the human female's naughty bits don't swell up to 5 times their normal size and turn bright red to signal her sexual availability. But is there anatomical evidence suggesting that women evolved to be highly sexual? No question. It turns out that every bit as much as a man's body, the woman's body, and preconscious behavior, is replete with indications of millennia of promiscuity and sperm competition. Considering its almost total lack of muscle tissue, the female breast wields amazing power. Curvaceous women have leveraged this power to manipulate even the most accomplished, disciplined men for as long as anyone's been around to notice. Empires have fallen, wills have been revised, millions of magazines and calendars sold, Super Bowl audiences scandalized, all in response to the mysterious force emanating from what are, after all, small bags of fat. One of the oldest human images known, the so-called Venus of Willendorf, created about 25,000 years ago, features a bosom of Dolly Parton-esque dimensions. 250 centuries later, the power of the exaggerated breast shows little sign of getting old. According to the American Society of Plastic Surgery, 347,254 breast augmentation procedures were performed in the United States in 2007, making it the nation's most commonly performed surgical procedure. What gives the female breast such transcendent influence over heterosexual male consciousness? First, let's dispense with any purely utilitarian interpretations. While the mammary glands contained in women's breasts exist for the feeding of infants, the fatty tissue that confers the magical curve of the human breast, the swell, sway, and jiggle, has nothing to do with milk production. Given the clear physiological costs of having pendulous breasts, back strain, loss of balance, difficulty running, if they aren't meant to advertise milk for babies, why did human females evolve and retain these cumbersome appendages? Theories range from the belief that breasts serve as signaling devices announcing fertility and fat deposits sufficient to withstand the rigors of pregnancy and breastfeeding, to genital echo theory. Females developed pendulous breasts around the time hominids began walking upright in order to provoke the excitation males formerly felt when gazing at the fatty deposits on the buttocks. Theorists supporting genital echo theory have noted that swellings like those of chimpanzees and bonobos would interfere with locomotion in a bipedal primate. So when our distant ancestors began walking upright, they reasoned that some of the female's fertility signaling moved from the rear office, as it were, to the front showroom. In a bit of historical ping-pong, the dictates of fashion have moved the swelling back and forth over the centuries, with high heels, Victorian bustles, and other derriere enhancements. The visual similarity between these two bits of female anatomy has been facilitated by the recent popularity of low-cut jeans that teasingly reveal the nether cleavage. "The butt crack is the new cleavage," writes journalist Janelle Brown, reclaimed to peek seductively from the pants of supermodels and commoners alike. "It's naughty and slightly tawdry," she continues, "but with the soft, round charm of a perfect pair of breasts." If your moon is waning, you can always don a butt bra from Bubbles Bodywear, which promises to create the effect that's been turning male heads since before men existed. Like the Victorian bustle, the butt bra mimics the full curves of the ovulating chimp or bonobo. Speaking of waning moons, it's worth noting that unless her breasts are artificially enhanced, as a woman's fertility fades with age, so do her breasts, further supporting the claim that they evolved to signal fertility. Human females aren't the only primates with fertility signals on their chests. The Gelida baboon is another vertically oriented primate with sexual swellings on the female's chests. As we'd expect, the Gelida swellings come and go with the female's sexual receptivity. As the human female is potentially always sexually receptive, her breasts are more or less always swollen from sexual maturity on. But not all female primates have genital swellings that visually announce their ovulatory status. Meredith Small reports that only 54 of the 78 species surveyed experience easily seen morphological changes during cycles, and that half of these showed only slight pinkness. Once again, our two closest primate cousins stand out from the pack, in terms of their decidedly indiscreet sexuality, being the only apes with such extravagant, brightly colored sexual swellings. The female chimp's red light district comes and goes, reflecting the waxing and waning of her fertility, but as Small confirms, the bonobo's swellings never change much, so that bonobo females always give a signal of fertility much as humans do. Although many theories claim the human female has hidden ovulation, it's not really hidden at all if you know how and where to look. Marty Hazelton and her colleagues found that men shown photographs of the same 30 women, some taken around ovulation and others not, were quite good at judging when the women were trying to look more attractive, which in turn corresponded to the women's menstrual status. These authors found that women tend to dress more fetchingly when they are more likely to be fertile. Moreover, writes Hazelton, the closer women were to ovulation when photographed in the fertile window, the more frequently their fertile photograph was chosen. Other researchers have found that men preferred women's bodily smells near ovulation, and that women tend to behave more provocatively in various ways when they're likely to be fertile. They wear more jewelry and perfume, go out more, are more likely to hook up for casual sexual encounters, and are less likely to use condoms with new lovers. Come again? Much as women's breasts have fascinated evolution-minded theorists, the female orgasm has confounded them. Like breasts, female orgasm is a major head-scratcher for mainstream narratives of human sexual evolution. It's not necessary for conception, so why should it exist at all? For a long time, scientists claimed that women were the only female animals to experience orgasm. But once female biologists and primatologists arrived on the scene, it became obvious that many female primates were having orgasms. The underlying motivation for claiming that female orgasm was unique to human beings probably lay in the role it played in the standard narrative. According to this view, orgasm evolved in the human female to facilitate and sustain the long-term pair bond at the heart of the nuclear family. Once you've swallowed that story, it becomes problematic to admit that the females of other primate species are orgasmic too. Your problem gets worse if the most orgasmic species happen to be the most promiscuous as well, which appears to be the case. As Alan Dixon writes, this monogamy maintenance explanation for female orgasm seems far-fetched. After all, he writes, females of other primate species, and particularly those with multi-male, multi-female, promiscuous mating systems, such as macaques and chimpanzees, exhibit orgasmic responses in the absence of such bonding or the formation of stable family units. On the other hand, Dixon goes on to note, gibbons, which are primarily monogamous, do not exhibit obvious signs of female orgasm. Although Dixon classifies humans as mildly polygynous in his survey of primate sexuality, he seems to have doubts, as when he writes, "One might argue that the female's orgasm is rewarding, increases her willingness to copulate with a variety of males rather than one partner, and thus promotes sperm competition." Donald Simmons and others have argued that orgasm is most parsimoniously interpreted as a potential all female mammals possess. What helps realize this potential in some human societies, argues Simmons, are techniques of foreplay and intercourse that provide sufficiently intense and uninterrupted stimulation for females to orgasm. In other words, Simmons thinks women have more orgasms than mares simply because men are better lovers than stallions. Stomp your foot 3 times if you believe this. In support of his theory, Simmons cites studies like Kinsey's showing that fewer than half of women questioned, Americans in the 1950s, experienced orgasm at least 9 out of 10 times they had intercourse, whereas in other societies, he refers to Mangaya in the South Pacific, elaborate and extended sexual play result in nearly universal orgasm for women. Orgasm, Simmons concludes, never is considered to be a spontaneous and inevitable occurrence for females, as it always is for males. For Simmons, Stephen Jay Gould, Elizabeth Lloyd, and others, some women have orgasms sometimes because all men do every time. For them, the female orgasm is the equivalent of male nipples, a structural echo without function in one sex of a trait vital in the other. Given all the energy required to get there, it's surprising that the female reproductive tract is not a particularly welcoming place for sperm cells. Researchers Robin Baker and Mark Bellis found that approximately 35% of the sperm are ejected within half an hour of intercourse, and those that remain are anything but home free. The female's body perceives sperm as antigens, foreign bodies, that are promptly attacked by anti-sperm leukocytes, which outnumber sperm 100 to 1. Only 1 in 14 million ejaculated human sperm even reach the oviduct. In addition to the obstacles imposed by the female's body, even those lucky few sperm are going to run into competition from other males, at least if our model of human sexuality has any validity. But while presenting obstacles to most sperm, the woman's body can assist others. There is striking evidence that the female reproductive system is capable of making subtle judgments based upon the chemical signature of different men's sperm cells. These assessments may go well beyond general health to the subtleties of immunological compatibility. The genetic compatibility of different men with a given woman means that sperm quality is a relative characteristic. Thus, as Ann Pusey explains, females may benefit from sampling many males, and different females will not necessarily benefit from mating with the same high-quality male. This is a crucially important point. Not every high-quality male would be a good match for any specific woman, even on a purely biological level. Because of the complexities of how the 2 sets of parental DNA interact in fertilization, a man who appears to be of superior mate value, square jaw, symmetrical body, good job, firm handshake, platinum Amex card, may in fact be a poor genetic match for a particular woman. So a woman and ultimately her child may benefit by sampling many males and letting her body decide whose sperm fertilizes her. Her body, in other words, might be better informed than her conscious mind. So in terms of reproduction, the fitness of our prehistoric male ancestors was not decided in the external social world, where conventional theories tell us men competed for mates in struggles for status and material wealth. Rather, paternity was determined in the inner world of the female reproductive tract, where every woman is equipped with mechanisms for choosing among potential fathers at a cellular level. Remember this next time you read something like, the predisposition for influence, substance, and prestige are all merely expressions of a male positioning himself to acquire women with whom to mate, or mate competition will involve contests over resources men's wives will need to raise children. This may well be the situation for most people today, but our bodies suggest our ancestors faced an entirely different scenario. Sperm competition is best understood not as a sprint to the egg, but a race over hurdles. Aside from the anti-sperm leukocytes mentioned previously, anatomical and physiological obstacles are in the vagina, cervix, and on the surface of the ovum itself. The complexity of the human cervix suggests it evolved to filter the sperm of various males. Concerning macaques, highly promiscuous monkeys, and humans, Dixon writes, "In the genus Macaca, all species of which are considered to have multi-male, multi-female mating systems, the cervix is especially complex in structure. The evidence pertaining to human beings and macaque females," he continues, indicates that the cervix acts both as a filtering mechanism and as a temporary reservoir for spermatozoa during their migration into the uterus. As with the complex penis and external testicles in the male, the elaborate filtering design of the human cervix points toward promiscuity in our ancestors. The idea that female choice, conscious or not, can happen after or during intercourse, rather than as part of an elaborate pre-copulatory courtship ritual, turns the standard narrative inside out and upside down. If the female's reproductive system has evolved intricate mechanisms for filtering and rejecting the sperm cells of some men, while helping along those of a man who meets criteria of which she may be utterly unaware, Darwin's coy female starts looking like what she is, an anachronistic male fantasy. But Darwin may have suspected more than he let on concerning post-copulatory mechanisms of sexual selection. Any discussion of human sexual behavior or the evolutionary implications of our genital morphology would have been extremely controversial in 1871, to put it mildly. Just imagine, as Dixon does, what would have occurred if the descent of man had included a detailed exposition of the evolution of the penis and testes, or descriptions of the various copulatory postures and patterns employed by animals and human beings. No one can blame Darwin for opting not to include chapters on the evolution of the penis and vagina in his already explosive work, but a century and a half is a long time for discretion and cultural bias to keep smothering scientific fact. To Meredith Small, the story of the female's role in conception is a miniature of the overall narrative. She sees popular understanding of conception as an outdated allegory of human sexuality, featuring the male as aggressor, persuader, conqueror. Recent research on human fertilization suggests something of a role reversal. Small suggests the ovum reaches out and envelops reluctant sperm. Female biology, she concludes, even at the level of egg and sperm interaction, doesn't necessarily dictate a docile stance. In addition to enveloping eggs, a cervix that filters or favors sperm, and vaginal contractions that may expel the sperm of one man while boosting that of another, women's orgasms provoke changes in vaginal acidity. These changes appear to assist the sperm cells of the lucky guy who provoked the orgasm. The environment at the cervical opening tends to be highly acidic and thus hostile to sperm cells. The alkaline pH of semen protects the spermatozoa in this environment for a while, but the protection is short-lived. Most of the sperm cells are viable within the vagina for only a few hours, so these changes in acidity alter the vaginal environment in ways that can favor sperm that arrive with the female's orgasm. The benefits may run both ways. Recent research suggests women who do not use condoms are less likely to suffer from depression than either women who do use condoms or who are not sexually active. Psychologist Gordon Gallup's initial survey of 293 women, data congruent with those from another survey still to be published that included 700 women, found that women can develop a chemical dependency on the boost they get from the testosterone, estrogen, prostaglandins, and other hormones contained in semen. These chemicals enter the woman's bloodstream through the vaginal wall. If it's true that multiple mating was common in human evolution, the apparent mismatch between the relatively quick male orgasmic response and the so-called delayed female response makes sense. Note how the female response is delayed only if the male's is assumed to be right on time. The male's quick orgasm lessens the chances of being interrupted by predators or other males, survival of the quickest, while the female and her child would benefit by exercising some preconscious control over which spermatozoa would be most likely to fertilize her ovum. Prolactin and the other hormones released at orgasm appear to trigger very different responses in men and women. While a man is likely to require a prolonged refractory or recovery period immediately after an orgasm, and maybe a sandwich and a beer as well, thus getting him out of the way of other males, many women are willing and able to continue sexual activity well beyond a starter orgasm. It's worth repeating that primate species with orgasmic females tend to be promiscuous. Given the great variability of mating behavior, even just among the apes, this is highly significant. While monogamous gibbons have rarely been seen copulating, so infrequent and silent is their intercourse, female chimps and bonobos go wild regularly and shamelessly. Females often mate with every male they can find, copulating far more than is necessary for reproduction. Goodall reported seeing one female at Gombe who mated 50 times in a single day. Echoing the Kama Sutra, Sherfei isn't shy about the implications of this mismatch of orgasmic capacity between human males and females, writing, "The sexual hunger of the female and her capacity for copulation completely exceeds that of any male, and, to all intents and purposes, the human female is sexually insatiable." That may or may not be, but it cannot be denied that the design of the human female's reproductive system is far from what the standard narrative predicts, and thus demands radical rethinking of the evolution of female sexuality. Part 5. Men are from Africa, women are from Africa.
The sooner we accept the basic differences between men and women, the sooner we can stop arguing about it and start having sex. Dr. Stephen T. Colbert, DFA.
Permeating the standard narrative of human sexual evolution is the depressing claim that men and women always have been and always will be locked in erotic conflict. The war between the sexes is said to be built into our evolved sexuality. Men want lots of no-strings lovers, while women want just a few partners with as many strings as possible. If a man agrees to be roped into a relationship, the narrative tells us, he'll be hell-bent on making sure his mate isn't risking his genetic investment by accepting deposits from other men, as it were. Extreme as it sounds, this is no overstatement. In his classic 1972 paper on parental investment, biologist Robert Trivers remarked, "One can, in effect, treat the sexes as if they were different species, the opposite sex being a resource relevant to producing maximum surviving offspring. In other words, men and women have such conflicting agendas when it comes to reproduction that we are essentially predators of one another's interests." In The Moral Animal, Robert Wright laments, "A basic underlying dynamic between men and women is mutual exploitation. They seem at times designed to make each other miserable." Don't believe it. We aren't designed to make each other miserable. This view holds evolution responsible for the mismatch between our evolved predispositions and the post-agricultural socio-economic world we find ourselves in. The assertion that human beings are naturally monogamous is not just a lie, it's a lie most Western societies insist we keep telling each other. There's no denying that men and women are different, but we are hardly different species, or from different planets, or designed to torment one another. In fact, the interlocking nature of our differences testifies to our profound mutuality. Let's look at some of the ways in which male and female erotic interests, perspectives, and capacities converge, intersect, and overlap, showing how each of us is a fragment of a greater unity. Chapter 20. On Mona Lisa's Mind.
Do I contradict myself? Very well then. I contradict myself. I am large. I contain multitudes. Walt Whitman, Song of Myself.
Faced with the mysteries of woman, Sigmund Freud, who seemed to have an answer for everything else, came up empty. Despite my 30 years of research into the feminine soul, he wrote, I have not yet been able to answer the great question that has never been answered. What does a woman want? It's no accident that what the BBC called the most famous image in the history of art is a study of the inscrutable feminine created by a homosexual male artist. For centuries, men have been wondering what Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa was thinking. Is she smiling? Is she angry? Disappointed? Unwell? Nauseated? Sad? Shy? Turned on? None of the above? Probably closer to all of the above. Does she contradict herself? Very well, then. The Mona Lisa is large. Like all women, but more, like all that is feminine, she reflects every phase of the moon. She contains multitudes. Our journey into a deeper understanding of the feminine soul begins in a muddy field in the English countryside. In the early 1990s, neuroscientist Keith Kendrick and his colleagues exchanged that season's newborn sheep and goats. The baby sheep were raised by adult goats and vice versa. Upon reaching sexual maturity a few years later, the animals were reunited with their own species and their mating behavior was observed. The females adopted a love the one you're with approach, showing themselves willing to mate with males of either species. But the males, even after being back with their own species for 3 years, would mate only with the species with which they were raised. Research like this suggests strong differences in degrees of erotic plasticity, changeability, in the males and females of many species, including ours. The human female's sexual behavior is typically far more malleable than the male's. Greater erotic plasticity leads most women to experience more variation in their sexuality than men typically do, and women's sexual behavior is far more responsive to social pressure. This greater plasticity could manifest through changes in whom a woman wants, in how much she wants him, her, them, and in how she expresses her desire. Young males pass through a brief period in which their sexuality is like hot wax waiting to be imprinted, but the wax soon cools and solidifies, leaving the imprint for life. For females, the wax appears to stay soft and malleable throughout their lives. This greater erotic plasticity appears to manifest in women's more holistic responses to sexual imagery and thoughts. In 2006, psychologist Meredith Chivers set up an experiment where she showed a variety of sexual videos to men and women, both straight and gay. The videos included a wide range of possible erotic configurations: man-woman, man-man, woman-woman, lone man masturbating, lone woman masturbating, a muscular guy walking naked on a beach, and a fit woman working out in the nude. To top it all off, she also included a short film clip of bonobos mating. While her subjects were being buffeted by this onslaught of varied eroticism, they had a keypad where they could indicate how turned on they felt. In addition, their genitals were wired up to plethysmographs. Isn't that illegal? No, a plethysmograph isn't a torture device, or a dinosaur for that matter. It measures blood flow to the genitals, a surefire indicator that the body is getting ready for love. Think of it as an erotic lie detector. What did Chivers find? Gay or straight, the men were predictable. The things that turned them on were what you'd expect. The straight guys responded to anything involving naked women, but were left cold when only men were on display. The gay guys were similarly consistent, though at 180 degrees. And both straight and gay men indicated with the keypad what their genital blood flow was saying. As it turns out, men can think with both heads at once, as long as both are thinking the same thing. The female subjects, on the other hand, were the very picture of inscrutability. Regardless of sexual orientation, most of them had the plethysmograph's needle twitching over just about everything they saw. Whether they were watching men with men, women with women, the guy on the beach, the woman in the gym, or bonobos in the zoo, their genital blood was pumping. But unlike the men, many of the women reported via the keypad that they weren't turned on. As Daniel Bergner reported on the study in the New York Times, with the women, mind and genitals seemed scarcely to belong to the same person. Watching both the lesbians and the gay male couple, the straight women's vaginal blood flow indicated more arousal than they confessed on the keypad. Watching good old-fashioned vanilla heterosexual couplings, everything flipped, and they claimed more arousal than their bodies indicated. Straight or gay, the women reported almost no response to the hot bonobo-on-bonobo action, though again, their bodily reactions suggested they kinda liked it. This disconnect between what these women experienced on a physical level and what they consciously registered is precisely what the theory of differential erotic plasticity predicts. It could well be that the price of women's greater erotic flexibility is more difficulty in knowing and, depending on what cultural restrictions may be involved, in accepting what they're feeling. This is worth keeping in mind when considering why so many women report lack of interest in sex or difficulties in reaching orgasm. This disconnect is also relevant to the research on jealousy we discussed in Chapter 10. If you aren't confused already, consider that research psychiatrist Andrei Anokin and his colleagues found that erotic images elicit significantly quicker and stronger response in women's brains than either pleasant or frightening images without erotic content. They showed 264 women a randomly ordered collection of images ranging from snarling dogs to water skiers to semi-naked couples getting hot and heavy. The women's brains responded about 20% faster to the erotic images than to any others. With men, this eager responsiveness was expected, but the results among the supposedly less visual, less libidinous women surprised the researchers. The female erotic brain is full of such surprises. Dutch researchers used positron emission tomography, PET, to scan the brains of 13 women and 11 men in the throes of orgasm. While the brevity of the male orgasm made reliable readings difficult to get, the heightened activity they found in the secondary somatosensory cortex associated with genital sensation was what they'd expected. But the women's brains left the researchers befuddled. It seems the female brain goes into standby mode at orgasm. What little increase in cerebral activity the ladies' brains exhibited was in the primary somatosensory cortex, which registers the presence of sensation but not much excitement about it. In women, the primary feeling is there, one of the researchers said, but not the marker that this is seen as a big deal. For males, the touch itself is all important. For females, it is not so important. Every woman knows her menstrual cycle can have profound effects on her eroticism. Spanish researchers confirmed that women experience greater feelings of attractiveness and desire around ovulation, while others have reported that women find classically masculine faces more attractive around ovulation, opting for less chiseled-looking guys when not fertile. Since the birth control pill affects the menstrual cycle, it's not surprising that it may affect a woman's patterns of attraction as well. Scottish researcher Tony Little found women's assessment of men as potential husband material shifted if they were on the pill. Little thinks the social consequences of his finding may be immense. Where a woman chooses her partner while she is on the pill and then comes off it to have a child, her hormone-driven preferences have changed and she may find she is married to the wrong kind of man. Little's concern is not misplaced. In 1995, Swiss biological researcher Klaus Wedekind published the results of what is now known as the sweaty t-shirt experiment. He asked women to sniff t-shirts men had been wearing for a few days with no perfumes, soaps, or showers. Wedekind found, and subsequent research has confirmed, that most of the women were attracted to the scent of men whose major histocompatibility complex, MHC, differed from her own. This preference makes genetic sense in that the MHC indicates the range of immunity to various pathogens. Children born of parents with different immunities are likely to benefit from a broader, more robust immune response themselves. The problem is that women taking birth control pills don't seem to show the same responsiveness to these male scent cues. Women who were using birth control pills chose men's t-shirts randomly, or, even worse, showed a preference for men with similar immunity to their own. Consider the implications. Many couples meet when the woman is on the pill. They go out for a while, like each other a lot, and then decide to get together and have a family. She goes off the pill, gets pregnant, and has a baby. But her response to him changes. There's something about him she finds irritating, something she hadn't noticed before. Maybe she finds him sexually unattractive, and the distance between them grows. But her libido is fine. She gets flushed every time she gets close enough to smell her tennis coach. Her body, no longer silenced by the effects of the pill, may now be telling her that her husband, still the great guy she married, isn't a good genetic match for her, but it's too late. They blame it on the work pressure, the stress of parenthood, each other. Because this couple inadvertently short-circuited an important test of biological compatibility, their children may face significant health risks, ranging from reduced birth weight to impaired immune function. How many couples in this situation blame themselves for having failed somehow? How many families are fractured by this common, tragic, undetected sequence of events? Psychologist Richard Lippa teamed up with the BBC to survey over 200,000 people of all ages from all over the world concerning the strength of their sex drive and how it affects their desires. He found the same inversion of male and female sexuality. For men, both gay and straight, higher sex drive increases the specificity of their sexual desire. In other words, a straight guy with a higher sex drive tends to be more focused on women, while higher sex drive in a gay guy makes him more intent on men. But with women, at least nominally straight women, the opposite occurs. The higher her sex drive, the more likely she'll be attracted to men and women. Lesbians showed the same pattern as men. A higher sex drive means more women-only focus. Perhaps this explains why nearly twice as many women as men consider themselves bisexual, while only half as many consider themselves to be exclusively gay. Those who claim this just means men are more likely to be repressing some universal human bisexuality will have to consider sexologist Michael Bailey's fMRI scans of gay and straight men's brains while they viewed pornographic photos. They reacted as men tend to do, simply and directly. The gay guys liked the photos showing men with men, while the straight guys were into the photos featuring women. Bailey was looking for activation of the brain regions associated with inhibition to see whether his subjects were denying a bisexual tendency. No dice. Neither gay nor straight men showed unusual activation of these regions while viewing the photos. Other experiments using subliminal images have generated similar results. Gay men, straight men, and lesbians all responded as predicted by their stated sexual orientation, while nominally straight women, I contain multitudes, responded to just about everything. This is just how we're wired, not the result of repression or denial. Of course, signs of repression aren't hard to find in sex research. There's plenty. For example, one of the long-standing mysteries of human sexuality has been that heterosexual men tend to report having more sexual encounters and partners than heterosexual women do, a mathematical impossibility. Psychologists Terry Fisher and Michelle Alexander decided to take a closer look at people's claims regarding age of first sexual experience, number of partners, and frequency of sexual encounters. Fisher and Alexander set up 3 different testing conditions. 1. The subjects were led to believe their answers might be seen by the researchers waiting just outside the room. 2. The subjects could answer the questions privately and anonymously. 3. The subjects had electrodes placed on their hand, arm, and neck, believing themselves, falsely, to be hooked up to a lie detector. Women who thought their answers might be seen reported an average of 2.6 sexual partners. All the subjects were college students younger than 25. Those who thought their answers were anonymous reported 3.4 partners, while those who thought their lies would be detected reported an average of 4.4 partners. So while women admitted to 70% more sexual partners when they thought they couldn't fib, the men's answers showed almost no variation. Sex researchers, physicians, and psychologists, and parents need to remember that women's answers to such questions may depend on when, where, and how the question is asked, as well as who's asking. If it's true that women's sexuality is much more contextual than most men's, we might need to reconsider a lot of what we think we know about female sexuality. In addition to the distortions created by the age bias we discussed earlier, are 20-year-olds representative? How useful are the responses of women answering questions in a cold classroom or laboratory setting? How would our understanding of female sexuality be different if George Clooney distributed the questionnaires by candlelight and collected them after a glass of wine in the jacuzzi? Sexologist Lisa Diamond spent over a decade studying the ebb and flow of female desire. In her book, Sexual Fluidity, she reports that many women see themselves as attracted to specific people rather than to their gender. Women, in Diamond's view, respond so strongly to emotional intimacy that their innate gender orientation can be easily overwhelmed. Chivers agrees. Women physically don't seem to differentiate between genders in their sex responses, at least heterosexual women don't. Apparently, many women see the Mona Lisa looking back at them from the mirror. What are the practical effects of this crucial difference in erotic plasticity? To start with, we'd expect to find far more transitory, situational bisexual behavior among women than among men. Various studies of heterosexual couples engaging in group sex or swinging agree that it is common for women to have sex with other women in these situations, but that men almost never engage with men. Additionally, while we'd be the last to suggest popular culture is a reliable indicator of innate human sexuality, it's probably significant that women kissing women has quickly become accepted as mainstream behavior, while depictions of men kissing each other on television or films remains unusual and controversial. Most women presumably wake up the morning after their first same-sex erotic experience more interested in finding some coffee than in conducting a panicked reassessment of their sexual identity. The essence of sexuality for most women seems to include the freedom to change as life changes around them. There is, after all, a liberating simplicity in Mona Lisa's complexity, which Freud seems to have missed. The answer to his question couldn't be simpler, yet it contains multitudes. What does woman want? It depends. Chapter 21. The Pervert's Lament.
Paraphilias are not universally present in human societies. Their incidence could be greatly reduced if tolerance and education in sexual matters were more widespread. This is a most important but socially sensitive area of sex research. Alan Dixon.
While many women are freed by their erotic flexibility, men can find themselves trapped by the rigidity of their sexual response, like the male sheep and goats mentioned earlier. Once determined, male eroticism tends to retain its contours throughout life, like concrete that has set. Consequently, the theory of erotic plasticity predicts that paraphilias, abnormal sexual desires and behaviors, should be far more prevalent in men than in women, who would presumably be more responsive to social pressures and find it easier to abandon previous turn-ons or ignore unseemly urges. Nearly every source of evidence supports this prediction. Most researchers and therapists agree that these unusual sexual hungers are almost exclusively seen in males, appear to be related to early imprinting, and are difficult, if not impossible, to alter once boyhood impressions have hardened into adult yearnings. Purely psychological treatment for paraphilias and pedophilia have shown little success. The most effective treatments for the latter tend to be based upon biological approaches, hormone therapy, chemical castration. Once beyond the age of malleability, males seem to be stuck with whatever imprint they've received, latex or leather, S or M, goat or lamb. If the influences during this developmental window are distorting and destructive, a boy may grow into a man with an unalterable, nearly irresistible desire to reenact the same patterns with others. The ritualized, widespread pedophilia in the Catholic Church appears to be a prime example of this process, as does the Church's centuries-long attempt to cover up the issue. Recall Schopenhauer's famous quote, "Mensch kann tun, was will, kann aber nicht wollen, was will." One can choose what to do, but not what to want. Desire, particularly male desire, is notoriously unresponsive to religious dictate, legal retribution, family pressure, self-preservation, or common sense. It does respond to one thing, however: testosterone. A man who suffered a hormonal disorder that left him with almost no testosterone for 4 months discussed his experience anonymously in a radio interview. Without testosterone, he said, everything I identified as being me was lost. My ambition, my interest in things, my sense of humor, the inflection of my voice. The introduction of testosterone returned everything. Asked whether there had been an upside to being testosterone-free, he said, "There were things that I find offensive about my own personality that were disconnected then, and it was nice to be without them. I approached people with a humility that I had never displayed before." But overall, he was glad to have it back because when you have no testosterone, you have no desire. Griffin Hansberry, who was born female but underwent a sex change after graduating from college, has another well-informed view of the powers of testosterone. "The world just changes," he said. "The most overwhelming feeling was the incredible increase in libido and change in the way I perceived women." Before the hormone treatments, Hansberry said, an attractive woman in the street would provoke an internal narrative. "She's attractive. I'd like to meet her." But after the injections, no more narrative. Any attractive quality in a woman, nice ankles or something, was enough to flood my mind with aggressive pornographic images just one after another. Everything I looked at, everything I touched turned to sex. He concluded, "I felt like a monster a lot of the time. It made me understand men. It made me understand adolescent boys a lot." It doesn't take a sex change operation to understand that many adolescent boys have a frenzied focus on sex. If you've ever tried to teach a class containing more than a few, or tried to raise one, or recall the turbulent desires yourself, you know the phrase testosterone poisoning is not always used ironically. For most adolescent boys, life often seems, and is, violent, hectic, and wild. Countless studies confirm that testosterone and associated male sex hormones are at high tide from puberty to a man's mid-20s. Here we have another massive conflict between what society dictates and biology demands. With every voice in a young man's body screaming for sex now, many societies insist he ignore these incessant urgings and channel that energy into other pursuits, ranging from sports to homework to military adventure. As with other attempts to block the unignorable importations of biology, this one has been a centuries-long disaster. Testosterone levels correlate to the likelihood of a young man or woman getting into trouble. In the United States, adolescent males are 5 times more likely to kill themselves than females are. A government study found that homosexual youth are 2 to 3 times more likely to attempt suicide than their heterosexual peers. Among Americans between 15 and 25, suicide is the 3rd leading cause of death, and teenage boys kill themselves at a rate double that of any other demographic group. Well-intentioned websites and presentations rarely, if ever, mention gut-wrenching, identity-clouding sexual frustration as a possible cause of some of this destructive adolescent behavior. Despite the omnipresence of billboards and bus stops featuring semi-naked, barely pubescent fashion models, significant parts of American society remain adamantly opposed to any suggestion that sexual activity may commence before the law allows. In 2003, 17-year-old honor student and homecoming king Giancarlo Wilson was caught having consensual oral sex with his girlfriend, who had not yet turned 16. He was convicted of aggravated child molestation, sentenced to a minimum of 10 years in a Georgia prison, and forced to register as a sex offender for life. If Wilson and his girlfriend had just enjoyed good old-fashioned intercourse, as opposed to oral sex, their crime would have been a misdemeanor, punishable by a maximum of a year in prison and no sex offender status. The previous year, Todd Centers videotaped consensual sex with his girlfriend, who was over the age of consent. No problem, right? Wrong. According to Nebraska state law, although the sex itself was perfectly legal, taping it constituted manufacturing child pornography. The 17-year-old was legally permitted to have sex, but images of her doing so are illegal. Go figure. Adolescents all over the country are getting into serious trouble for sexting one another, snapping a risque photo of themselves with their cell phone and sending it to a friend. Turns out, in many states, these kids can be sent to prison, where sexual abuse is rampant, for photographing their own bodies, manufacturing child pornography, and sharing the photos, distributing child pornography. They're being forced to register as sex offenders, despite the fact that they themselves are the victims of their own crimes. Just say what? A 2005 survey of 12,000 adolescents found that those who had pledged to remain abstinent until marriage were more likely to have oral and anal sex than other teens, less likely to use condoms, and just as likely to contract sexually transmitted diseases as their unapologetically non-abstinent peers. The study's authors found that 88% of those who pledged abstinence admitted to failing to keep their pledge. If our distorted relationship with human sexuality is the source of much of this frustration, confusion, and ignorance, societies with less conflicted views should confirm the causal connection. Developmental neuropsychologist James Prescott found that bodily pleasure and violence seem to have an either-or relationship. The presence of one inhibits development of the other. In 1975, Prescott published a paper in which he argued that certain sensory experiences during the formative periods of development will create a neuropsychological predisposition for either violence-seeking or pleasure-seeking behaviors later in life. On the level of individual development, this finding seems obvious. Adults who abuse children were almost always victims of childhood abuse themselves, and every junkyard owner knows that if you want a mean dog, beat the puppy. Prescott applied this logic on a cross-cultural level. He performed a meta-analysis of previously gathered data on the amount of physical affection shown to infants, years of breastfeeding, percentage of time in direct physical contact with mother, being fondled and played with by other adults, and overall tolerance for adolescent sexual behavior. After comparing these data with levels of violence within and between societies, Prescott concluded that in all but one of the cultures for which these data were available, 48 of 49, deprivation of body pleasure throughout life, but particularly during the formative periods of infancy, childhood, and adolescence, is very closely related to the amount of warfare and interpersonal violence. Cultures that don't interfere in the physical bonding between mother and child, or prohibit the expression of adolescent sexuality, show far lower levels of violence, both between individuals and between societies. While American society twists itself into positions no yoga master could hold, Britney Spears was a vocal virgin while pole dancing in bikinis on TV, other societies ritualize and seek to structure adolescent sexuality in positive ways. Mangayan youth are encouraged to have sex with one another, with particular emphasis on the young men learning to control themselves and take pride in the pleasure they can provide a woman. The Maurya of central India set up adolescent dormitories, called godals, where adolescents are free to sleep together, away from concerned parents. In the godal, the young people are encouraged to experiment with different partners, as it's considered unwise to become too attached to a single partner at this phase of life. If we accept that our species is and always has been optimized for a highly sexual life, and that adolescent boys are especially primed for action, why should we be surprised by the explosions of destructive frustration that result from the thwarting of this primal drive? Kellogg's Guide to Child Abuse. In 1879, Mark Twain gave a speech in which he observed, "Of all the forms of intercourse, masturbation has the least to recommend it. As an amusement," he said, "it is too fleeting. As an occupation, it is too wearing. As a public exhibition, there's no money in it." Funny guy, Mark Twain. But there was a seriousness in his humor as well as courage. As Twain spoke, much of Western culture was waging a bizarre, centuries-long war against any hint of childhood sexuality, including masturbation. The merciless campaign against masturbation was just one aspect of the West's long struggle against the sinful yearnings within human sexuality. We've discussed the so-called witches burned alive for daring to assert or even suggest their eroticism, and doctors like Isaac Baker Brown, who justified barbaric, dangerous surgery as a cure for nascent nymphomania. These were not exceptional cases, as Twain knew. Following the advice of such prominent experts as John Harvey Kellogg, many parents of Twain's day subjected their children to brutal physical and mental abuse to stamp out any sign of sexuality. Otherwise reasonable, if confused people ardently believed that masturbation truly was the destroying element of civilized society, in the words of the New Orleans Medical and Surgical Journal. Though widely considered to be one of the leading sex educators of his day, Kellogg proudly claimed never to have had intercourse with his wife in over 4 decades of marriage. But he did require a handsome male orderly to give him an enema every morning, an indulgence his famously high-fiber breakfasts should have made unnecessary. As John Money explains in his study of pseudoscientific anti-sex crusaders, The Destroying Angel, Kellogg would probably be diagnosed as a klismophile today. Klismophilia is an anomaly of sexual and erotic functioning traceable to childhood in which an enema substitutes for regular sexual intercourse. For the klismophile, writes Money, putting the penis in the vagina is experienced as hard work, dangerous, and possibly as repulsive. As a medical doctor, Kellogg claimed the moral authority to instruct parents on the proper sexual education of their children. If you're unfamiliar with the writings of Kellogg and others like him, their gloating disdain for basic human eroticism is chilling and unmistakable. In his best-selling Plain Facts for Old and Young, written on his sexless honeymoon in 1888, Kellogg offered parents guidance for dealing with their son's natural erotic self-exploration in a section entitled Treatment for Self-Abuse and Its Effects. A remedy which is almost always successful in small boys, he wrote, is circumcision. He stipulated that the operation should be performed by a surgeon without administering an anesthetic, as the brief pain attending the operation will have a salutary effect upon the mind, especially if it be connected with the idea of punishment. If circumcising a struggling, terrified boy without anesthesia wasn't quite what a parent had in mind, Kellogg recommended the application of 1 or more silver sutures in such a way as to prevent erection. The prepuce, or foreskin, is drawn forward over the glands, and the needle to which the wire is attached is passed through from one side to the other. After drawing the wire through, the ends are twisted together and cut off close. It is now impossible for an erection to occur. Parents were assured that sewing their son's penis into its foreskin acts as a most powerful means of overcoming the disposition to resort to the practice of masturbation. Circumcision remains prevalent in the United States, though varying greatly by region, ranging from about 40% of newborns circumcised in western states to about twice that in the Northeast. This widespread procedure, rarely a medical necessity, has its roots in the anti-masturbation campaigns of Kellogg and his like-minded contemporaries. As Money explains, neonatal circumcision crept into American delivery rooms in the 1870s and 1880s, not for religious reasons, and not for reasons of health or hygiene, as is commonly supposed, but because of the claim that later in life it would prevent irritation that would cause the boy to become a masturbator. Lest you think Kellogg was interested only in the sadistic torture of boys, in the same book he soberly advises the application of carbolic acid to the clitorises of little girls to teach them not to touch themselves. Kellogg and his like-minded contemporaries demonstrate that sexual repression is a malady that considers itself the remedy, to paraphrase Karl Kraus's dismissal of psychoanalysis. His smug satisfaction in tormenting children is striking and disturbing, but Kellogg's "no child left alone" policy is anything but unusual or limited to ancient history. The anti-masturbation measures quoted above were published in 1888, but more than 80 years were to pass before the American Medical Association declared, in 1972, masturbation is a normal part of adolescent sexual development and requires no medical management. But still, the war continues. As recently as 1994, pediatrician Joycelyn Elders was forced from her post as Surgeon General of the United States for simply asserting that masturbation is part of human sexuality. The suffering caused by centuries of war on masturbation is beyond calculation. But this we know. All the suffering, every bit of it, was for nothing. Absolutely nothing. John Harvey Kellogg, Anthony Comstock, and Sylvester Graham, inventor of graham crackers, like cornflakes, a food specifically designed to discourage masturbation, were extreme in their grim campaigns against eroticism, but they weren't considered particularly eccentric at the time. Recall that Darwin probably had had little or no personal sexual experience when he married his first cousin a month before his 30th birthday, and that Sigmund Freud, the other towering giant of 19th century sexual theory, was a self-proclaimed 30-year-old virgin when he married in 1886. No wonder Freud was hesitant sexually. According to biographer Ernest Jones, Freud's father had threatened to cut off young Sigmund's penis if he didn't stop his obsessive masturbating. The Curse of Calvin Coolidge.
Last time I tried to make love to my wife, nothing was happening. So I said to her, "What's the matter? You can't think of anybody either?" Rodney Dangerfield. Men don't care what's on TV. They only care what else is on TV. Jerry Seinfeld.
There's a story about President Calvin Coolidge and a chicken farm every evolutionary psychologist knows by heart. It goes like this. The president and his wife were visiting a commercial chicken farm in the 1920s. During the tour, the First Lady asked the farmer how he managed to produce so many fertile eggs with only a few roosters. The farmer proudly explained that his roosters happily performed their duty dozens of times each day. "Perhaps you could mention that to the president," replied the First Lady. Overhearing the remark, President Coolidge asked the farmer, "Does each cock service the same hen each time?" "Oh, no," replied the farmer. "He always changes from one hen to another." "I see," replied the president. "Perhaps you could point that out to Mrs. Coolidge." Whether the story is historically factual or not, the invigorating effect of a variety of sexual partners has become known as the Coolidge effect. While there's little doubt that the females of some primate species, including our own, are also intrigued by sexual novelty, the underlying mechanism appears to be different for them. Thus, the Coolidge effect generally refers to male mammals, where it's been documented in many species. But that doesn't mean women's only motivation for sex is relational, as is often argued. Psychologists Joey Sprague and David Quadagno surveyed women from 22 to 57 years of age and found that among those under 35, 61% of the women said their primary motivation for sex was emotional rather than physical. But among those over 35, only 38% claimed their emotional motivations were stronger than the physical hunger for contact. At face value, such results suggest women's motivations change with age. Or one could also argue that this effect could simply reflect women becoming less apologetic as they mature. First-time travelers to Istanbul, Bali, Gambia, Thailand, or Jamaica may be surprised to see thousands of middle-aged women from Europe and the United States who flock to these places in search of no-strings sexual attention. An estimated 80,000 women fly to Jamaica looking to rent a Rasta every year. The number of female Japanese visitors to the Thai island resort Phuket jumped from fewer than 4,000 in 1990 to 10 times that just 4 years later, outnumbering male Japanese tourists significantly. Chartered jets carrying nothing but Japanese women land in Bangkok every week, if not daily. In her book, Romance on the Road, Jeanette Beliveau catalogs dozens of destinations frequented by such women. That this sort of behavior would seem unbelievable and embarrassing to most of the young American women filling out questionnaires for their psychology professors is both result and cause of a more general scientific and cultural blindness to the true contours of female sexuality. Of course, there are plenty of men looking for sexual variety on the beaches of Thailand as well, but since that just supports the standard narrative, it seems unimportant. Until it is.
That tiger ain't go crazy. That tiger went tiger. You know when he was really crazy? When he was riding around on a unicycle with a Hitler helmet on. Chris Rock, talking about a circus tiger that attacked a trainer. By temperament, which is the real law of God, many men are goats and can't help committing adultery when they get a chance. Whereas there are numbers of men who, by temperament, can keep their purity and let an opportunity go by if the woman lacks in attractiveness. Mark Twain, Letters from the Earth.
A man we know, we'll call him Phil, could be considered a living icon of male achievement. All names and identifying details have been changed. In his early 40s, handsome, he's been married to Helen, a gorgeous, accomplished physician, for almost 20 years. They have 3 brilliant, beautiful daughters. Phil and a friend started a small software business in their late 20s, and now, 15 years later, they've both got more money than they'll ever be able to spend. Until recently, Phil lived in a big, beautiful house on a hill overlooking a wooded valley. But Phil's life was, as he puts it, a disaster waiting to happen. Disaster struck when Helen discovered the affair he'd been having with a work colleague. Unsurprisingly, she felt deeply betrayed and expressed her outrage by locking him out of the house, refusing even to let him see their children until the lawyers had finished their dismal task. Phil's seemingly perfect life came crashing down around him. Comedian Chris Rock said, "A man is basically as faithful as his options." Phil's professional success, good looks, and charming personality generated a constant stream of sexual opportunity. Many male readers are probably thinking, of course he was sleeping with another woman or 2, come on. But if you're a woman, you may be thinking, of course his wife and daughters locked the pig out. Is there any way to reconcile these 2 opposed perspectives on this all-too-common situation? What could possibly motivate so many men who are otherwise demonstrably intelligent, loving, and cautious to risk so much for so little? Everything from the respect of their friends to the love of their children can be lost in the quest for something as transitory and ultimately meaningless as a casual sexual encounter. What are they thinking? We asked Phil. At first, he said, the sex was fantastic. I hadn't felt so alive in years. I thought I was in love with Monica. the other woman. "When I was with her, it was like everything was stronger, you know? Food tasted better, colors were richer, I had so much more energy. I felt high all the time." When we asked if the sex he had with Monica was better than it had been with Helen, Phil paused for a long moment. "Actually," he admitted, "now that I think about it, sex with Helen was much better. The best I've ever had, really. At the beginning, you know, those first few years. I mean, with Helen, it was never just sex. We both knew we wanted to spend our lives together, so there was a depth and, well, a love and spiritual connection I've never had with anyone else. Even though Helen says she hates me now, I honestly believe we'll always have that connection, even if she won't admit it." "So what happened?" "Over the years, you know how it is, the passion faded and our relationship changed. We became friends, best friends, but still, siblings, almost. It's not her fault. I know this is all my fault, but what can I do?" His eyes tearing up, he said, "It felt like a life-or-death situation. I wanted to feel alive again. I know how ridiculous that sounds, but that's how it felt." Phil is at a prime age for the so-called midlife crisis that seems to hit many men around this stage of their lives. Explanations are easy to come by, ranging from economics — he finally has enough money and status to be attractive to the sort of sexy young women who had ignored him previously — to existential dread — he's coming to terms with his own mortality by lashing out symbolically against his own impending aging and death — to the wife's life cycle. She's nearing menopause, so he's biologically driven toward the fertility of younger women. Each of these may have some measure of truth, but none answers the most pressing question. Why do men have such overwhelming hunger for variety in their sexual partners, not just at midlife, but always? If the ghost of Calvin Coolidge weren't haunting him, a man would simply buy a DVD or two of his favorite porn actress and watch it over and over the rest of his life. Knowing how the movie ends is hardly going to ruin the experience for him. No, what makes heterosexual men seek a constant stream of different women doing the same old things is the Coolidge effect. If you've never been to a porn gateway website, you'll be astounded by the variety and specificity of the offerings there. Everything from unshaved Japanese lesbians to tattooed redheads to overweight older gals. It's a simple, unavoidable truth almost everyone knows to be true, but few dare to discuss. Variety and change are the necessary spice of the sex life of the human male. But an intellectual understanding of this aspect of most men's inner reality doesn't make accepting it any easier for many women. Writer and film director Nora Ephron has explored these issues in many of her films, including Heartburn, which was based on her own failed marriage. In a 2009 interview, she explained how raising 2 sons had informed her view of men. "Boys are so sweet," she said, "but the problem with men is not whether they're nice or not, it's that it's hard for them at a certain point in their lives to stay true. It just is. It's almost not their fault." But then she added, "It feels like it's their fault if you are involved with any of them." The perils of monogamy plus monotony.
The prerequisite for a good marriage, it seems to me, is the license to be unfaithful. Carl Jung, in a letter to Freud, dated January 30th, 1910.
Remember what Phil said about how sex with his wife had grown overly familiar? How he'd come to feel he and Helen were siblings almost? Interesting word choice. The strongest explanation for the prevalence and intensity of the Coolidge effect among social mammals is that the male drive for sexual variety is evolution's way of avoiding incest. Our species evolved on a sparsely populated planet, never more than a few million, and probably fewer than 100,000 of us on Earth for most of our evolutionary past. To avoid the genetic stagnation that would have dragged our ancestors into extinction long ago, males evolved a strong appetite for sexual novelty and a robust aversion to the overly familiar. While this carrot and stick mechanism worked well to promote genetic diversity in the prehistoric environment, it's causing lots of problems now. When a couple have been living together for years, when they've become family, this ancient anti-incest mechanism can effectively block eroticism for many men, leading to confusion and hurt feelings all around. Earlier, we discussed how men's testosterone levels recede over the years, but it's not just the passing of time that brings these levels down. Monogamy itself seems to drain away a man's testosterone. Married men consistently show lower levels of the hormone than single men of the same age. Fathers of young children even less. Men who are particularly responsive to infants show declines of 30% or more right after their child is born. Married men having affairs, however, were found to have higher testosterone levels than those who weren't. Additionally, most of the men having affairs have told researchers they were actually quite happy in their marriages, while only 1/3 of women having affairs felt that way. Of course, sharp-thinking readers will point out that these correlations don't imply causation. Maybe men with higher levels of testosterone simply seek more affairs. Probably so, but there is good reason to believe that even casual contact with novel, attractive women can have a tonic effect on men's hormonal health. In fact, researcher James Roney and his colleagues found that even a brief chat with an attractive woman raised men's testosterone levels by an average of 14%. When these same men spent a few minutes talking with other men, their testosterone level fell by 2%. In the 1960s, anthropologist William Davenport lived among a group of Melanesian islanders who regarded sex as natural and uncomplicated. All the women claimed to be highly orgasmic, with most reporting several orgasms to each of her partners one. Nevertheless, reported Davenport, it is assumed that after a few years of marriage, the husband's interest in his wife will begin to pale. Until the recent imposition of colonial laws stopped the practice, these Melanesians avoided monotony by allowing married men to have young lovers. Rather than being jealous of these concubines, wives regarded them as status symbols, and Davenport claimed that both men and women regarded the loss of this practice the worst result of contact with European culture. Older men often comment today that without young women to excite them, and without the variety once provided by changing concubines, they have become sexually inactive long before their time. Closer to home, William Masters and Virginia Johnson reported that loss of coital interest engendered by monotony in a sexual relationship is probably the most constant factor in the loss of an aging male's interest in sexual performance with his partner. They note that this loss of interest can frequently be reversed if the man has a younger lover, even if the lover is not as attractive or sexually skilled as the man's wife. Kinsey concurred, writing, "There seems to be no question but that the human male would be promiscuous in his choice of sexual partners throughout the whole of his life if there were no social restrictions." We know that many female readers aren't going to be happy reading this, and some will be enraged by it, but for most men, sexual monogamy leads inexorably to monotony. It's important to understand this process has nothing to do with the attractiveness of the man's long-term partner or the depth and sincerity of his love for her. Indeed, quoting Simmons, a man's sexual desire for a woman to whom he is not married is largely the result of her not being his wife. Novelty itself is the attraction. Though they're unlikely to admit it, the long-term partners of the sexiest Hollywood starlets are subject to the same psychosexual process. Frustrating, unfair, infuriating, humiliating on both sides? Yes, 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 and yes. But still, true. What to do about it? Most modern couples aren't as flexible about tolerating a variety of sexual partners as the Melanesians and many of the societies we surveyed in earlier chapters. After reviewing the broad literature on Western marriage, sociologist Jesse Bernard argued in the early 1970s that increasing men's opportunities for sexually novel partners was one of the most important social changes required in Western societies to promote marital happiness. But this hasn't happened yet, and seems even less likely now, almost 4 decades later. Maybe this is why some 20 million American marriages can be categorized as no sex or low sex due to the man's loss of sexual interest. According to the authors of He's Just Not Up For It Anymore, 15 to 20% of American couples have sex fewer than 10 times per year. They note that the absence of sexual desire is the most common sexual problem in the country. Combine these dismal numbers with the 50% of all marriages that end in divorce, and it's clear that modern marriage is suffering a soft-core meltdown. In The Evolution of Human Sexuality, the ever-quotable Donald Simmons pointed out that Western societies have tried every trick in the book to change this aspect of male sexuality, but all have failed miserably. Human males seem to be so constituted that they resist learning not to desire variety, he wrote. Despite impediments such as Christianity and the doctrine of sin, Judaism and the doctrine of mensch, social science and the doctrines of repressed homosexuality and psychosexual immaturity, evolutionary theories of monogamous pair bonding, cultural and legal traditions that support and glorify monogamy. Need we supplement Simmons's thoughts with a list of specific examples of men, presidents, governors, senators, athletes, musicians, who have squandered family and fortune, power and prestige, all for an encounter with a woman whose principal attraction was her novelty? Need we remind female readers of the men in their past who seemed so smitten at first, but mysteriously stopped calling once the thrill of novelty had faded? A few more reasons I need somebody new, just like you.
Making love with a woman and sleeping with a woman are two separate passions, not merely different but opposite. Love does not make itself felt in the desire for copulation, a desire that extends to an infinite number of women, but in the desire for shared sleep, a desire limited to one woman. Milan Kundera, The Unbearable Lightness of Being.
Remember how Phil said he felt high when he was with his new lover? Colors were richer, food tasted better. There's a reason for this intensification of sensation, but it's not love. As their testosterone levels decline with age, many men experience a diminishment of energy and libido, an intangible distance from the basic pleasures of life. Most attribute this blurred distance to stress, lack of sleep, or too much responsibility, or they just chalk it up to the passage of time. True enough, but some of this numbing could be due to ebbing testosterone levels. Recall the man who had no testosterone for a while. He felt he'd lost everything I identify as being me. His ambition, passion for life, sense of humor, all gone. Until testosterone brought it all back. Without the testosterone, he said, you have no desire. Phil thought he was in love. Of course he did. As suggested above, one of the few things that reliably revives a male's sagging testosterone levels is a novel lover. So he felt all the things we associate with love, renewed vitality, a new depth and intensification, a giddy thrill at being alive. How easily we mistake this potent mix of feelings for love. But a hormonal response to novelty isn't love. How many men have mistaken this hormone high for a life-altering spiritual union? How many women have been blindsided by a good man's seemingly inexplicable betrayal? How many families have been ripped apart because middle-aged men misinterpreted the surge of vitality and energy resulting from a novel sexual partner as love for a soulmate, or convinced themselves they were in love to justify what felt like a life-affirming necessity? And how many of these men then found themselves isolated, shamed, and devastated when the curse of Coolidge returned after a few months or years to reveal that the now familiar partner was not, in fact, the true source of those feelings after all? No one knows the number, but it's a big one. This common situation is heavy with tragedy, but one of the most painful aspects may be that many of these men will realize that the woman they left behind was a far better match than the one they left her for. once the transitory thrill passes, these men are left once again with the realities of what makes a relationship work over the long run. Respect, admiration, convergent interests, good conversation, sense of humor, and so on. A marriage built upon sexual passion alone has as much chance of enduring as a house built on winter ice. Only by arriving at a more nuanced understanding of the nature of human sexuality will we learn to make smarter decisions about our long-term commitments. But this understanding requires us to face some uncomfortable facts. Like many men in the same situation, Phil said he felt as if he faced a life-or-death decision. Maybe he did. Researchers have found that men with lowered levels of testosterone are more than 4 times as likely to suffer from clinical depression, fatal heart attacks, and cancer when compared to other men their age with higher testosterone levels. They are also more likely to develop Alzheimer's disease and other forms of dementia, and have a far greater risk of dying from any cause, ranging from 88 to 250% higher depending on the study. If it's true that most men are constituted by millions of years of evolution to need occasional novel partners to maintain an active and vital sexuality throughout their lives, then what are we saying to men when we demand lifetime sexual monogamy? Must they choose between familial love and long-term sexual fulfillment? Most men don't fully appreciate the conflict between the demands of society and those of their own biology until they've been married for years. Plenty of time for life to have grown very complicated, with children, joint property, mutual friends, and the sort of love and friendship only shared history can bring. When they arrive at the crisis point, where domesticity and declining testosterone levels have drained the color from life, what to do? The options most men see before them seem to be 1. Lie and try not to get caught. While this option may be the most commonly chosen, it may also be the worst. How many men think they have an unspoken agreement with their wife that as long as she doesn't find out about it, it's okay for him to have a casual relationship on the side? This is like saying you have an unspoken agreement with the police that it's okay to drive drunk as long as they don't catch you. Even if there is some understanding along those lines, any lawyer will tell you that unspoken agreements are the worst possible foundation for any long-term partnership. A. Gentlemen, you are going to get caught sooner or later, probably sooner. You have as much chance of getting away with this as a dog has of following a cat up a tree. Ain't gonna happen. One reason, most women's sense of smell is significantly better than most men's, so there's probably going to be evidence you can't even sense, but that she'll pick up on. Need we even mention the much-vaunted powers of female intuition? B. This requires you to lie to your partner in life, to deceive the mother of your children, the person you were hoping to grow old with. Is this really who you are? Is this the man she chose to share her life with? 2. Give up on having sex with anyone other than your wife for the rest of your life. Maybe resort to porn and Prozac. A. Antidepressants are the most prescribed drug in the United States, with 118 million prescriptions written in 2005 alone. One of the most prominent side effects of these drugs is the dampening of libido, so maybe the whole issue will just fade away, chemical castration. If not, there's always Viagra, with well over 1 billion tablets doled out in the decades since it was introduced in 1998. But Viagra creates blood flow, not desire. Now men can fake sexual interest too. Progress? B. It's not the same, is it? And isn't there something humiliating, not to say emasculating, about sneaking off at night to look at porn on your computer? This course often leads to serious anger and resentment that can destroy a relationship. 3. Serial monogamy, divorce and start over. This option seems to be the honest approach recommended by most experts, including many relationship counselors. A. Serial monogamy is a symptomatic response to the issues posed by the conflict between what society dictates and what biology demands. It solves nothing in terms of snowballing male and thus female sexual frustration in long-term sexually monogamous relationships. B. Though often presented as the honorable response to the conundrum, the serial monogamy cop-out has led directly to the current epidemic of broken homes and single-parent families. How is it adult to inflict emotional trauma on our children because we're unable to face the truth about sex? Susan Squire, author of I Don't, A Contrarian History of Marriage, asks, why does society consider it more moral for you to break up a marriage, go through a divorce, disrupt your children's lives, maybe forever, just to be able to fuck someone with whom the fucking is going to get just as boring as it was with the first person before long? A man who pursues long-term happiness by leaving behind a string of hurt, embittered women and emotionally wounded children is little more than a dog chasing tail. His own. And if you're a woman whose husband is cheating, your options are no better. Pretend you don't notice what's going on, go out and have your own revenge affair, even if you don't feel like it, or destroy your own family and marriage by calling in the lawyers. These are all losing scenarios. Even the term we use to describe this betrayal of self and family, cheating, echoes the standard narrative of human sexuality in its implication that marriage is a game that one player can win at the expense of the other. The woman who tricks a man into supporting children he thinks are his has, according to this model, cheated and won. Another big winner, according to the standard narrative, is the baby daddy who manages to impregnate a string of women who then raise his children while he's already on to his next conquest. But in any true partnership, married or not, cheating cannot lead to any sort of victory. It's win-win, or everybody loses. Chapter 22. Confronting the Sky Together.
Love is not breathlessness. It is not excitement. It is not the promulgation of promises of eternal passion. That is just being in love, which any of us can convince ourselves we are. Love itself is what is left over when being in love has burned away. Louis de Bernier, Corelli's Mandolin. There is a cost for the society that insists on conformity to a particular range of heterosexual practices. We believe that cultures can be rationally designed. We can teach and reward and coerce. But in so doing, we must also consider the price of each culture, measured in the time and energy required for training and enforcement, and in the less tangible currency of human happiness that must be spent to circumvent our innate predispositions. E. O. Wilson.
So now what? Having written this whole book about sex, we'd like to confusingly suggest that most of us take sex way too seriously. When it's just sex, that's all it is. In such cases, it's not love, or sin, or pathology, or a good reason to destroy an otherwise happy family. Like the Victorians, most contemporary Western societies inflate the inherent value of sex by restricting supply, good girls don't, and inflating demand, girls gone wild. This process leads to a distorted vision of just how important sex actually is. Yes, sex is essential, but it's not something that must always be taken so seriously. Think of food, water, oxygen, shelter, and all the other elements of life crucial to survival and happiness, but that don't figure in our day-to-day thinking unless they become unavailable. A reasonable relaxation of moralistic social codes, making sexual satisfaction more easily available, would also make it less problematic. This appears to be the overall trajectory of history. While many are perplexed and disturbed by the hooking up culture, the sexting of racy images back and forth, full recognition of all legal rights for gay male and lesbian couples, and so on, there's not much they can do to stop any of it for long. In terms of sexuality, history appears to be flowing back toward a hunter-gatherer casualness. If so, future generations may suffer fewer pathological manifestations of sexual frustration and unnecessarily fractured families. Concerning the Siriano with whom he lived, Holmberg writes, "The Siriano rarely, if ever, lack for sexual partners. Whenever the sex drive is up, there is almost always an available partner willing to reduce it." Sex anxiety seems to be remarkably low in Siriano society. Such manifestations as excessive indulgence, continence, or sex dreams and fantasies are rarely encountered. How would it feel to live in such a world? Well, we all know how it feels to live in this one. Apart from death itself, what causes as much human misery as the ongoing demise of marriage? In 2008, almost 40% of the mothers who gave birth in the United States were unmarried. This matters. As Caitlin Flanagan reported recently in Time, on every single significant outcome related to short-term well-being and long-term success, children from intact two-parent families outperform those from single-parent households. Longevity, drug abuse, school performance and dropout rates, teen pregnancy, criminal behavior and incarceration, in all cases, the kids living with both parents drastically outperform the others. Love is an ideal thing, marriage a real thing, observed German philosopher Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. A confusion of the real with the ideal never goes unpunished. Indeed, by insisting upon an ideal vision of marriage founded upon a lifetime of sexual fidelity to one person, a vision most of us eventually learn is highly unrealistic, we invite punishment upon ourselves, upon each other, and upon our children. The French are much more comfortable with the idea that their affair partner is just that, an affair partner, writes Pamela Druckerman in her cross-cultural look at infidelity, Lust in Translation. Understanding that love and sex are different things, Druckerman says the French feel less need to complain about their marriage to legitimize the affair in the first place. But she found that Americans and British couples seem to be reading from an entirely different script. An affair, even a one-night stand, means a marriage is over, Druckerman observed. I spoke to women who, on discovering that their husbands had cheated, immediately packed a bag and left because that's what you do. Not because that's what they wanted to do, they just thought that was the rule. They didn't even seem to realize there were other options. I mean, really, like they're reading from a script. Psychologist Julian Jaynes described the commingling of terror and exhilaration one experiences upon realizing that things are not as they'd seemed. There is an awkward moment at the top of a Ferris wheel when, having come up the inside curvature where we are facing into a firm structure of confident girders, suddenly that structure disappears and we are thrust out into the sky for the outward curve down. This is the moment too many couples struggle in vain to avoid or ignore, even to the point of choosing bitter divorce and fractured family over the daunting task of confronting the sky together with all the confident girders behind them in the past. The false expectations we hold about ourselves, each other, and human sexuality do us serious lasting harm. As author and sex advice columnist Dan Savage explains, the expectation of lifelong monogamy places an incredible strain on a marriage, but our concept of love and marriage has as its foundation not only the expectation of monogamy, but the idea that where there's love, monogamy should be easy and joyful. To be sure, toe-curlingly passionate sex can be an important part of marital intimacy, but it is a grave mistake to think it's the essence of long-term intimacy. Like every other kind of hunger, sexual desire tends to be smothered by its satisfaction. Squire says that thinking of marriage as an enduring romance is unrealistic. It's not like you want to rip your clothes off with somebody that you're sleeping with for the 1,000th time. We should know going into it that the nature of love and sex changes from what it begins as, and that a great love affair doesn't necessarily make a great marriage. High libido sex can just as easily be an expression of the utter absence of intimacy. Consider the notorious one-night stand, the prostitute, basic physical release. Couples might find that the only route to preserving or rediscovering intensity reminiscent of their early days and nights requires confronting the open, uncertain sky together. They may find themselves having their most meaningful, intimate conversations if they dare to talk about the true nature of their feelings. We don't mean to suggest these will be easy conversations. They won't be. There are zones where it's always going to be difficult for men and women to understand one another, and sexual desire is one of them. Many women will find it difficult to accept that men can so easily dissociate sexual pleasure from emotional intimacy, just as many men will struggle to understand why these two obviously separate, to them, issues are often so intertwined for many women. But with trust, we can strive to accept even what we cannot understand. One of the most important hopes we have for this book is to provoke the sorts of conversations that make it a bit easier for couples to make their way across this difficult emotional terrain together, with a deeper, less judgmental understanding of the ancient roots of these inconvenient feelings and a more informed, mature approach to dealing with them. Other than that, we really have little helpful advice to offer. Every relationship is a constantly changing world that requires specific attention. Other than warning you to be wary of those who offer one-size-fits-all relationship advice, our best counsel echoes that of Polonius to Laertes in Hamlet. To thine own self be true, and it must follow, as the night the day, thou canst not then be false to any man or woman. Still, it will take more than a deeper understanding of ourselves and each other to fully address the many issues raised by a more relaxed and tolerant approach to fidelity. The people I feel sorry for are the ones who don't even realize they have any other choices beyond the traditional options society presents, says Scott, who is a member of a long-term triad relationship with Teresa, a woman, who is also involved with Larry, whom Scott introduced to Teresa. While such 3- or 4-person committed relationships have by necessity flown under the radar until recently, so-called polyamorous families are thought to number about 500,000 in the United States, according to an article in Newsweek. Although Helen Fisher thinks people involved in such configurations are fighting Mother Nature by trying to confront their insecurities and jealousy head-on, there is plenty of evidence that, for the right people, such arrangements can work out very well for all concerned, even the kids. As Sarah Hrdy reminds us, conventional couples struggling to raise a family in isolation might be the ones fighting Mother Nature. Since Darwin, she writes, we have assumed that humans evolved in families where a mother relied on one male to help her rear her young in a nuclear family. Yet the diversity of human family arrangements is better predicted by assuming that our ancestors evolved as cooperative breeders. From our perspective, people like Scott, Larry, and Teresa appear to be trying to replicate ancient human sociosexual configurations. As we've seen from a child's perspective, having more than 2 stable, loving adults around can be enriching, whether in Africa, the Amazon, China, or suburban Colorado. Laird Harrison recently wrote about his experience growing up in a house his biological parents shared with another couple and their children. He recalled, "The communal household enjoyed a kind of camaraderie I have never felt since. I swapped books with my stepsisters, listened in awe to their stories of crushes, exchanged tips on teachers. Their father imparted his love of great music and their mother her passion for cooking. A sort of bond formed among the 10 of us." Everybody out of the closet.
An era can be considered over when its basic illusions have been exhausted. Arthur Miller.
Much of recent history can be seen as waves of tolerance and acceptance breaking against the rocky headlands of rigid social structures. Though it can seem to take almost forever, the waves always win in the end, reducing immobile rock to shifting sand. The 20th century saw the headlands beginning to crumble under surges of anti-slavery movements, women's rights, racial equality, and more recently, the steadily growing acceptance of the rights of gay, lesbian, transgender, and bisexual people. Author Andrew Sullivan described his experience growing up both gay and Catholic as difficult to the point of agony, I saw in my own life and those of countless others, Sullivan recalled, that the suppression of these core emotions and the denial of their resolution in love always leads to personal distortion and compulsion and loss of perspective. Forcing people into molds they do not fit helps no one, Sullivan wrote. It robs them of dignity and self-worth and the capacity for healthy relationships. It wrecks family, twists Christianity, violates humanity. It must end. Sullivan's comments were provoked by the twisted collapse of the publicly homophobic but privately homosexual televangelist Ted Haggard, but he could have been speaking for anyone who doesn't fit the socially sanctioned mold of his or her day. And who does fit this mold? Yes, self-hating gay televangelists and politicians need to come out of the closet, but so does everyone else. It won't be easy. It's never easy to stand up to shame-fueled anger. Historian Robert S. McIlvaine previews some of the shrill denunciation awaiting those who may dare to wander from the monogamous fold, declaring, "Free love is likely to degenerate into free hate. Since loving everybody is a biological impossibility, the attempt to do so becomes otherization and the hatred that goes with it." Like McIlvaine, many relationship counselors seem both terrified by and ignorant of non-standard marital relationships of any kind. Esther Perel, author of Mating in Captivity, quotes a family therapist she knows and respects, stating unequivocally, "Open marriage doesn't work. Thinking you can do it is totally naive. We tried it in the 70s, and it was a disaster." Maybe, but such therapists might want to delve a little deeper before reflexively dismissing alternatives to conventional marriage. Asked to imagine the first swingers in modern American history, most people probably picture hairy hippies in headbands lolling about on waterbeds in free love communes under posters of Che Guevara and Jimi Hendrix, Jefferson Airplane on the hi-fi. But be cool, Daddy-O, 'cause the truth is gonna blow your mind. It seems that the original modern American swingers were crew-cut World War II Air Force pilots and their wives. Like elite warriors everywhere, these Top Guns often developed strong bonds with one another, perhaps because they suffered the highest casualty rate of any branch of the military. According to journalist Terry Gould, key parties, like those later dramatized in the 1997 film The Ice Storm, originated on these military bases in the 1940s, where elite pilots and their wives intermingled sexually with one another before the men flew off toward Japanese anti-aircraft fire. Gould, author of The Lifestyle, A Cultural History of the Swinging Movement in the United States, interviewed two researchers who'd written about this Air Force ritual. Joan and Dwight Dixon explained to Gould that these warriors and their wives shared each other as a kind of tribal bonding ritual, with a tacit understanding that the 2/3 of husbands who survived would look after the widows. Recall Beckerman's description of mate sharing in the Amazon. You know that if you die, there's some other man who has a residual obligation to care for at least one of your children. So looking the other way, or even giving your blessing when your wife takes a lover, is the only insurance you can buy. The practice continued after the war ended, and by the late 1940s, military installations from Maine to Texas and California to Washington had thriving swing clubs, writes Gould. By the end of the Korean War in 1953, the clubs had spread from the air bases to the surrounding suburbs among straight white-collar professionals. Are we to believe that these fighter pilots and their wives were naive? It's true that many high-profile American forays into alternative sexuality in the 1970s ended in chaos and hurt feelings, but what does that prove? Americans also tried, and failed, to reduce their reliance on foreign oil in the 1970s. By this logic, it would be naive to ever try again. Besides, in intimate matters, discretion and success tend to go together, so no one really has any idea how many couples succeeded in finding their own unconventional understandings by experimenting with low-key alternatives to standard off-the-shelf monogamy. What isn't debatable is that conventional marriage is a full-blown disaster for millions of men, women, and children right now. Conventional till death, or infidelity or boredom do us part marriage is a failure. Emotionally, economically, psychologically, and sexually, it just doesn't work over the long term for too many couples. Yet while few mainstream therapists would contemplate trying to convince a gay man or lesbian to grow up, get real, and just stop being gay these days, when it comes to unconventional approaches to heterosexual marriage, Perel points out, sexual boundaries are one of the few areas where therapists seem to mirror the dominant culture. Monogamy, she writes, is the norm, and sexual fidelity is considered to be mature, committed, and realistic. Forget about negotiating alternatives. Non-monogamy, even consensual non-monogamy, is suspect. The notion that it might be possible to love one person while being sexual with another makes us shudder and conjures images of chaos, promiscuity, orgies, debauchery. Couples who turn to a therapist hoping for guidance on ways to loosen but not break the bonds of standard monogamy are likely to be offered little but defensive condemnation and stilted bromides, like this advice from an evolutionary psychology-based self-help book called Mean Genes. The temptations we all face are deeply ingrained in the genes of our hearts and minds, but as long as we remain interesting dynamos, there will be no conflict between monogamy and our infidelity-promoting mean genes. Interesting dynamos? No conflict? Sure. Tell that to Mrs. Coolidge. Perel is the rare therapist willing to publicly consider the possibility that heterosexual couples might find alternative arrangements that can work well for them, even if they find themselves outside the bounds of what mainstream society approves. She writes, "It's been my experience that couples who negotiate sexual boundaries are no less committed than those who keep the gates closed. In fact, it is their desire to make the relationship stronger that leads them to explore other models of long-term love." There are an infinite number of ways to adapt a flexible and loving partnership to our ancient appetites. Despite what most mainstream therapists claim, for example, couples with open marriages generally rate their overall satisfaction, with both their relationship and with life in general, significantly higher than those in conventional marriages do. Polyamorists have found ways to incorporate additional relationships into their lives without lying to one another and destroying their primary partnership. Like many gay male couples, these people recognize that additional relationships need not be taken as indictments of anyone. Dossie Easton and Catherine List, authors of The Ethical Slut, write, "It is cruel and insensitive to interpret an affair as a symptom of sickness in the relationship, as it leaves the cheated-on partner, who may already be feeling insecure, to wonder what is wrong with him. Many people have sex outside their primary relationships for reasons that have nothing to do with any inadequacy in their partner or in the relationship." Despite centuries of religious and scientific propaganda, the basic illusions underpinning the supposed naturalness of the conventional nuclear family are clearly exhausted. This collapse has left many of us isolated and unfulfilled. Blind insistence and well-intentioned inquisitions have failed to turn the tide and show no signs of future success. Rather than endless war between the sexes, or rigid adherence to a notion of the human family that was never true to begin with, we need to seek peace with the truths of human sexuality. Maybe this means improvising new familial configurations. Perhaps it will require more community assistance for single mothers and their children. Or maybe it just means we must learn to adjust our expectations concerning sexual fidelity. But this we know. Vehement denial, inflexible religious or legislative dictate, and medieval stoning rituals in the desert have all proved powerless against our prehistoric predilections. In 1988, Roy Romer, then governor of Colorado, faced a feeding frenzy of questions about his long-running extramarital affair that had become publicly known. Romer did what few public figures have dared. In the spirit of the Yucatan, he refused to accept the premise underlying the intrusive questions, that his extramarital relationship was a betrayal of his wife and family. Instead, he called an extraordinary press conference where he pointed out that his wife of 45 years had known about and accepted the relationship all along. Romer confronted the tittering reporters with life as it really happens. "What is fidelity?" he asked the suddenly silent gaggle of reporters. "Fidelity is what kind of openness you have, what kind of trust you have, which is based on truth and openness. And so in my own family, we've discussed that at some length, and we've tried to arrive at an understanding of what our feelings are, what our needs are, and work it out with that kind of fidelity." The Marriage of the Sun and the Moon. In a sky swarming with uncountable stars, clouds endlessly flowing, and planets wandering, always and forever there has been just one moon and one sun. To our ancestors, these two mysterious bodies reflected the female and the male essences. From Iceland to Tierra del Fuego, people attributed the sun's constancy and power to his masculinity. The moon's changeability, unspeakable beauty, and monthly cycles were signs of her femininity. To human eyes turned toward the sky 100,000 years ago, they appeared identical in size, as they do to our eyes today. In a total solar eclipse, the disk of the moon fits so precisely over that of the sun that the naked eye can see solar flares leaping into space from behind. But while they appear precisely the same size to terrestrial observers, scientists long ago determined that the true diameter of the sun is about 400 times that of the moon. Yet incredibly, the sun's distance from Earth is roughly 400 times that of the moon's, thus bringing them into unlikely balance when viewed from the only planet with anyone around to notice. Some will say, interesting coincidence. Others will wonder whether there isn't an extraordinary message contained in this celestial convergence of difference and similarity, intimacy and distance, rhythmic constancy and cyclical change. Like our distant ancestors, we watch the eternal dance of our sun and our moon, looking for clues to the nature of man and woman, masculine and feminine, here at home.
This has been an Audible Inc. production of Sex at Dawn, The Prehistoric Origins of Modern Sexuality, written by Christopher Ryan and Casilda Jetha, narrated by Allison Johnson and Jonathan Davis, with a preface written and read by Christopher Ryan. Executive producer, Steve Feldberg. Producer, Mike Charzik. Music by Michael Whalen. Copyright 2010 by Christopher Ryan and Casilda Jetha. Production copyright 2010 by Audible Inc.